The snow still falls over the quiet Polish hills where the earth remembers what men try to forget. Beneath the frost lies Belzec, a name once whispered in fear, now barely spoken at all. No tourists, no survivors' village nearby, only silence. But under that silence, 500,000 souls are buried without a trace of stone or cross. This was not Auschwitz, not Treblinka. It was worse in one way. Because here, almost everyone who entered never came back to tell the world what happened. The Nazis built it to vanish, a factory of death designed to erase its own existence. Yet the ground still breathes with what they try to hide. And tonight, we will dig into the heart of that darkness, to remember Belzec, the forgotten camp of death. Chapter 1, Seeds of Extermination. From T4 to Operation Reinhard. The door closed with a hiss of gas. Somewhere, far from the battlefields and front lines of Europe, death had become a silent science. It did not scream. It did not bleed. It simply happened, efficiently, predictably, and without witnesses. The men who designed it wore white coats instead of uniforms. They spoke in numbers and procedures instead of hate. And in the heart of Germany, behind sealed hospital doors, they began testing the machinery that would later devour millions. It started with mercy, at least that's what they called it. The euthanasia program, known as Action T4, was not born in the shadows. It was signed by Adolf Hitler himself in the autumn of 1939, just as the world was plunged into war. The Führer's order was simple. The incurably sick, the disabled, the mentally ill, they would be granted deliverance from suffering. But deliverance was a word chosen carefully to hide the truth. What it meant was extermination. At first, the killings were small, almost clinical. Doctors selected patients by reviewing files, never meeting them in person. A mark on a paper decided who lived and who died. Gas chambers were disguised as showers, their walls tiled to look clean and harmless. Carbon monoxide from car engines filled the rooms as nurses turned their faces away. The air turned thick, the sound faded, and in less than 10 minutes, silence returned. Outside, trucks arrived and left in strict order. Inside, death became routine. Crematoriums burned all traces. Ashes were placed in urns and mailed to families with forged death certificates claiming pneumonia or heart failure. Words became masks for murder, and as the months passed, the men behind T4 learned a terrible efficiency. They refined timing, perfected gas flow, calculated how many could die in one cycle. They learned to make killing quiet. The T4 centers, Grafenegg, Brandenburg, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Bernburg, and Hadamar, were not battlefields. There were no soldiers there, only doctors and clerks. Yet they would become the training grounds for the Holocaust. Behind those walls, the techniques of mass death were engineered, tested, and improved, ready to be exported east, to places with no eyes watching. Christian Worth was one of the men who learned in those rooms. A former policeman, blunt and unflinching, he oversaw T4's killing centers with mechanical precision. Under him, the staff grew accustomed to death's rhythm. Drivers, guards, and even carpenters became part of a system that functioned like a factory. When Hitler suspended the official euthanasia program in August 1941, after public outrage in Germany, the men of T4 did not fade away. They were quietly reassigned, gathered for something larger, something secret. By then, the war in the East was raging. The German invasion of the Soviet Union had unleashed a new kind of brutality. Behind the advancing armies, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, shot Jews, communists, and civilians by the tens of thousands. But even mass shootings proved too slow, too visible, too psychologically damaging to the executioners themselves. Germany needed something cleaner, faster, more concealed. The bureaucrats in Berlin began to whisper about a final solution. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, became its architect. He spoke of evacuation, resettlement, and special treatment. Beneath the language, the goal was clear: total extermination of the Jews of Europe. But this was not a task for frontline soldiers. It required men with experience in organized killing. And so, the veterans of Action T4 were summoned. Christian Worth, Franz Stangl, Kurt Gerstein, Odilo Globoknik, men who had already turned morality into machinery. In the autumn of 1941, orders went out from the SS and police leader of the Lublin district, Odilo Globoknik. A vast operation was to begin in the general government, the Nazi term for occupied Poland. Its code name, Operation Reinhard, named after Reinhard Heydrich himself. The mission, build and operate extermination camps designed solely for one purpose: to murder the Jewish population of Poland. There would be no selections, no labor, no prison barracks. The victims would arrive by train and die within hours. Everything, from their clothing to their gold teeth, would be stripped, sorted, and sent back to Germany. And the knowledge to do this on such a scale came directly from T4. The same engineers who had built the gas chambers in German asylums now drafted blueprints for new facilities, this time under the open sky of Poland. The same drivers who once delivered patients to healing centers would soon transport victims to camps like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The same gas engines that powered euthanasia chambers would be installed again, bigger, more efficient, fed by engines taken from captured Soviet tanks. What had once been murder disguised as mercy was now industrialized genocide disguised as deportation. In a quiet corner of Berlin, at Tiergartenstrasse 4, the address that gave Action T4 its name, files were still being sorted, numbers tallied. The paper trail was clean. The euthanasia program had ended. But in truth, it had only evolved. Its doctors and technicians were now working under new titles: construction inspectors, transport specialists, camp supervisors. Their experience was invaluable, their methods proven. What they had perfected in hospitals would now be scaled to millions. By November 1941, the foundations for the first of the Operation Reinhard camps were already being laid. The site chosen was a small village in southeastern Poland, Belzec, remote, quiet, surrounded by forests and rail lines. A perfect place to disappear people without trace. Christian Worth was sent there to oversee construction. He arrived with a team of T4 men, builders who knew how to design gas chambers that looked harmless. They constructed wooden barracks disguised as bathhouses. They created a tube, a narrow, fenced corridor leading from the undressing area to the gas chamber doors. It would later be called the Schlouch. The victims would be told they were going to be disinfected before resettlement. They would walk down the path, naked and confused, as the SS men shouted and dogs barked. They would see flowers painted on the walls, a Star of David over the entrance, a deception that made death look ordinary. In Berlin, the bureaucracy churned on. Meetings at the Reich Chancellery used words like rationalization, relocation, and final disposal. Reports were filed, budgets approved. Behind this sterile language, an entire nation's moral compass had been inverted. Killing was no longer an act of war. It was an administrative task. But not everyone could remain numb. Some of the men from T4, those who had once considered themselves healers, found themselves haunted. Kurt Gerstein, an SS officer and engineer responsible for delivering Zyklon B gas to concentration camps, witnessed the killings and broke down. Years later, he would try to alert the world, writing frantic reports describing what he had seen at Belzec and Sobibor. The screaming, the chaos, the faces pressed against glass. He begged neutral diplomats to intervene. His conscience had awakened too late. Most, however, did not resist. They believed in duty, in orders, in the illusion of necessity. Christian Worth himself called the mass killings a technical problem, one that could be solved with discipline and efficiency. The doctors who once killed the mentally ill now applied their precision to murdering families. Every step of the process, arrival, undressing, gassing, burning, was timed, recorded, and improved. By early 1942, Operation Reinhard was fully underway. Trains rolled day and night. Deportation lists filled the desks of German officials. Somewhere between statistics and logistics, Human beings vanished into numbers. And yet, in those numbers, the seeds of extermination had already been planted years earlier. In the hospitals where doctors learned to kill quietly, in the offices where death became paperwork, in the hearts of men who replaced empathy with obedience. The air in those camps was not just heavy with the stench of burning bodies. It was thick with the smell of bureaucracy turned to ash. As the Reich expanded eastward, so too did its machinery of murder. What began as an experiment in mercy killing evolved into the systematic annihilation of entire populations. The medical professionals of T4 became the logistical backbone of genocide. They brought with them their charts, their procedures, their cold logic. The line between science and slaughter had been crossed, and there was no going back. Hitler never visited these killing centers. He didn't have to. His signature on a single document had unleashed a process that now moved on its own momentum, self-sustaining, self-justifying. Ministers, generals, and clerks all played their part, each convinced they were doing something necessary, something for the good of the Reich. The echoes of the T4 program would soon resonate far beyond Germany's borders. Its veterans would build Belzec, then Sobibor, then Treblinka, each one more efficient than the last. The knowledge gained from euthanizing the sick had become a model for murdering the innocent. And as Christian Worth stood on the frozen soil of southeastern Poland, supervising the finishing touches on Belzec, he might have felt a grim sense of pride. The camp was ready. The gas chambers had been tested. The guards had been trained. The deception perfected. He had taken the lessons of the euthanasia centers and turned them into the blueprint for mass extinction. In a few short weeks, the first transports would arrive. Thousands would be told they were going to work. They would carry luggage, family photos, hope. They would step off the trains, smell the pine trees, hear the distant rumble of engines. They would not know that the men greeting them were the same men who had once gassed the patients of German hospitals, the same men who had learned how to make murder feel like medicine. And as the first whistle blew and the first freight car door opened at Belzec, history would take its darkest turn. The machinery of death, once tested on the weak and the voiceless, was now ready to consume an entire people. The men of T4 had completed their transformation, from healers to killers, from doctors to destroyers. And the quiet forests of Poland were about to become the graves of a nation. But before the gas chambers filled, before the earth began to tremble beneath the weight of ash, one final question remained among the architects of death. Could they keep it secret? Could they truly erase what they were about to do? The answer would lie in the smoke that soon rose from the chimneys of Belzec, smoke that the wind would carry far beyond the borders of the Reich and into the conscience of the world. Chapter 2. Choosing the Killing Ground. Why Belzec? The train rolled in under a leaden sky, a long, low sigh of metal and wood that tasted of cold iron and coal smoke. Men in uniforms watched the cars slide past, counting timetables in their heads like prayers. Far from the platforms and the cities, a small market town lay folded into the brown of the plains. Fields, forests, a station with 4 tracks, and a quiet that made it useful. That quiet was the first commodity the killers needed. Silence, distance, the kind of place where a scream could be absorbed by pine and peat and never answered. Why Belzec? It sounds like a question of geography. But choice is never only maps and compass points. It is politics, logistics, fear, and the strange arithmetic of human cruelty. The site that became Belzec was chosen because it answered a bundle of practical problems with brutal clarity. It sat in the general government, the Nazi administration for occupied Poland, far from Europe's capitals, far from the prying eyes of neutral diplomats and a press still pretending not to know. It was on a railway spur that could take trains from the major Jewish population centers of the Lublin district, from Krakow, from the Galician towns of Lwów and Tarnopol. In the language of the men who planned murder, that meant throughput. In the language of the millions who would die, it meant disappearance. Walk the ground, and you understand more. The soil is peat and loam, soft underfoot, easily dug. In winter it holds snow that muffles sound. In summer, a choke of tall grass hides the tracks and the smoke. Surrounding woods provide a curtain, and beyond them, villages whose eyes were habitually turned elsewhere. The camp could be built low, camouflaged, and kept away from the routes of ordinary traffic. That mattered. The Nazis had learned painfully and pragmatically that spectacle undermined speed, that mobs and witnesses slowed murder. So they sought places that could swallow people without a collective gasp. Railway access is the heartbeat of any deportation. Belzec stood near a junction, a practical hub for cattle and freight wagons that could be repurposed for human cargo. Freight cars for livestock and coal were indistinguishable from those that would come to carry people. The tracks bent toward Lublin and then on into the eastern borderlands where, before the war, entire communities had lived in synagogues, in shtetl streets, in market squares. These rail links meant that the camp could be fed steadily, a schedule of trains rather than the chaos of ad hoc roundups. Efficiency, again, was key. For the architects of murder, the train timetable was a production plan. But there were more mundane considerations as well. Local labor, storage space, a supply of building materials. Camps needed lumber, nails, iron, engines, and the men to erect fences and barracks. Belzec's proximity to railway yards and timber sources made construction simpler, and the region had a thin administrative web. Local officials, when instructed to look away or assist, were often pliant. The system was not only top-down, it needed cooperative seams. Station masters, foremen, and civil clerks could be coaxed, threatened, or co-opted into silence. In that silence, the machinery of deportation could begin without public uproar. The political context shaped the geography. By the autumn of 1941, Reinhard Heydrich's plans were moving from theory to implementation. The decision to concentrate the killing in specially constructed camps was not made in a day. It was debated over reports and maps, with men in gray offices ticking boxes on projections and budgets. But the choice of sites required fieldwork, assessments by engineers and SS supervisors who traveled, looked at soil, timed the daylight, and noted where the rail sidings could be extended. Odilo Glaboknik, the SS leader for the Lublin district, pushed for locations that minimized the risk of discovery while maximizing capacity. Belzec fit the bill. For ordinary people in the surrounding villages, the arrival of road teams and work crews was the first sign. Men measuring ground, carpenters unloading planks, an envelope of secrecy. Workers were told they were building warehouses, farms, or resettlement barracks. They were paid, or coerced, or simply forced to obey. A veneer of normalcy was laid over the site, a faintly ridiculous attempt at routine to thin suspicion. The camp needed to look ordinary, to be ordinary, until the day it would not be. That ordinary look made it easier to bring people in without panic, to bear the illusion of process. There were, too, the darker, quieter questions: proximity to towns where Jews could be assembled, the ease with which ghettos could be liquidated and residents crammed onto trains, the relative weakness of local resistance networks. Lublin had already become a nerve center for occupation policy. From its offices, the machinery of ghettoization and supply logistics was directed. Place a killing center within a day's rail journey of Lublin, and you compress time. Trains could be scheduled to arrive in numbers that matched the capacity of the killing rooms. That compression of time was a strategic choice. Rapid turnover reduces the chance of revolt, reduces the chance of organized rescue, reduces the chance of information leaking outward. In practical terms, it made murder easier to manage. Anatomy of a site also involves deception. The planners at Belzec designed entry routes that could be controlled, small courtyards that kept groups segregated, and disguised buildings that resembled mundane public facilities. The Schlouch, the tube, would later become infamous for its psychological cruelty, but it began as an architectural answer to one question: how to move people without resistance into a sealed room. Undressing spaces were adjacent to corridors painted with the blandness of institutional life. Signs in German and Polish could be placed to convey the illusion of administration. The superficial theatricality was purposeful. A believable farce made mass murder run smoother. Yet not every choice was purely technical. Symbolism crept into the selection too. The Nazis wanted to operate in places where the victims could be anonymized, where bewildered communities would not be able to place individual faces. Selecting a remote location meant that the victims were not mere neighbors to the local peasantry. They became nameless arrivals from the East, numbers on lists. Dehumanization begins with erasure of identity. The landscape aided that erasure. Belzec was not a city where victims could be easily cataloged by neighbors. It was a backwater that swallowed names. Local reaction varied. Some peasants hurried away. Others watched with a nervous curiosity. Some were recruited as seasonal labor to work on the camp's construction or to haul materials. There were those who would later say they understood nothing. There were those who tried to listen to rumors and piece together a truth. In the initial months, rumors trickled. An increase in trains, the arrival of SS personnel with cold faces, the presence of engineers with clipboards. People noticed the deployment of barbed wire and the fences erected along the sidings. But humans also have a willful capacity to ignore, to continue with harvest and barter, to tell themselves that what they could not bear to learn must not be true. That willful blindness was a social lubricant for atrocity. The administration bent local institutions to its will. Post offices and telegraph stations were co-opted for efficient communication. Railway dispatchers were ordered to prioritize certain cars. Records were kept in neat ledgers that would later form a bureaucratic map of disappearance. Men who wrote those entries sat at desks 200 miles from the stations where human beings were being herded, and yet their pens were as lethal as the gas engines. Technical competence and paperwork merged into a framework of death. Belzec's choice was also influenced by secrecy protocols originating from T4 experience. The euthanasia program had taught the SS the value of plausible deniability, of falsified death certificates, of the camouflage of humane medical language. At Belzec, similar strategies would be used to obscure the reality of what was happening. Trains arrived under the cover of freight schedules. Arrival reports were drafted with euphemisms. Staff wore civilian clothes at times to minimize overt signs of militarization. This culture of concealment was the lineage from which Operation Reinhard was drawn. There was a technical cunning to the way the site was bounded. The camp's perimeter could be kept small, guard towers positioned where they surveyed nothing but forest and the occasional dirt road. This minimized the number of witnesses who might see movement, and also contained the labor force tasked with cremation and disposal. Men assigned to those gruesome duties were often selected from among prisoners, the Jewish Sonderkommandos coerced into service. Their labor would be hidden not only by fences, but by daily schedules that dispersed smoke and smell. The choice of Belzec's landscape helped mask sensory evidence, at least for a while. Smoke could be channeled into wooded areas. Ash could be scattered. The earth itself would become an accomplice. Even as planners ticked boxes on technical assessments, they watched the political winds. The German war machine needed secrecy as it prepared for expansion. Operation Reinhard was, in part, a response to earlier Nazi anxieties about international condemnation. By building isolated facilities and engineering concealment, the leadership hoped to avoid the diplomatic fallout they had learned to fear. Belzec was not merely a logistical choice. It was an experiment in impunity. And then there was timing. The winter of 1941 turned to spring with the throb of military operations in the East. The momentum of war provided cover. Busy front lines distracted attention. The forced migration of populations under military pressure made the mass movement of trains appear less conspicuous in a larger noise of wartime displacement. In other words, the chosen moment made the crime more likely to succeed. All these calculations converged on the clearing where Belzec would rise. Men with clipboards stood where later the undressing barracks would stand. Engineers surveyed the ground. They imagined rooms with gas inlets, chimneys, pits for burning, the lines of trains that would disgorge people who believed themselves on a normal journey. A plan took shape on drafting tables. The weighing of capacity against concealment, the layout that minimized resistance, the small steps that make a monstrous system work. Human beings lived in the orbit of those decisions. Jewish communities in the Lublin region, shopkeepers, teachers, shoemakers, mothers with infants, received orders first to gather, later to carry limited belongings to holding points, to wear yellow stars, to rattle through checkpoints toward the rails. In the weeks before the camps were fully operational, there were arrests and roundups, rumors of resettlement, lists compiled by clerks who did not look up from their ledgers. In the deafening normality of those administrative acts, fate was decided. As structures rose, fences, sheds, rails extended, the reality of Belzec began to take on a terrible shape. Men who had once managed forests or station yards found themselves under orders to clear new spaces. The land itself, hospitable to secrecy, was being reworked into a machine. Where hay once grew, foundations were poured. Where children once played, a perimeter was hammered into place. And yet, for all this technicality, there remained an absurdity. A camp so designed for concealment that its only witnesses were those least likely to be believed. Peasants who saw trains at night were dismissed as gossipmongers. Station clerks who inked arrival logs were told to file them away. The very measures that made Belzec efficient also made it maddeningly invisible to those with power to intervene. When the first elements of the camp were complete, when the last plank was nailed and the fences tightened, there was a moment, small, brittle, where the planners tested their work. Guards practiced routing people. Men in SS uniforms rehearsed the choreography of arrival and dispersal, and carpenters made small adjustments to doors and corridors. It was a rehearsal for the largest performance of organized murder Europe had yet seen. The final line of selection for a site is often a human one. The men who signed off on Belzec saw not fields or forests, but an experiment in managed annihilation. They calculated risk, structured concealment, and planned logistics in a way that stripped the human face from their victims and replaced it with a production schedule. That was the genius and the horror of the choice. And when the site was declared ready, when the tracks could bear the weight of cattle wagons repurposed for people, the planners sent word back to Lublin. The first transports could be routed, the timetable set. Somewhere in those encoded messages lay an order that would change everything. The machines were in place. The rails awaited. The first whistle was yet to blow. Chapter 3, Blueprint for Death, Planning and Construction, November 1941 to March 1942. They unfolded the drawings on a rickety table and shaded them with pencil like men planning a factory. Lines ran into boxes, boxes into rooms, rooms into conveyor paths. The whole thing looked to the eyes trained on efficiency like a small railway plant. The men at the table were not engineers imagining locomotives. They were SS officers and technicians who had learned to measure human bodies in cubic centimeters and minutes. Here, in late 1941, the idea moved from paper into timber and earth. The blueprints were precise because the goal required precision, concealment, speed, and no witnesses. The first thing they did was clear the land. It sounds simple. Trees felled, sod turned, but the act carried a weight almost ceremonial in its wrongness. Forest became scaffold. Logs were stacked neatly in rows as if for a village fair. The air filled with the smell of sap and dust, ordinary and mechanical and suddenly sinister. Men with calloused hands pulled down branches. They grunted and spat and spoke in short, efficient sentences. Local laborers and forced workers were pressed into service. Some were paid. Most were given orders that would have meant death for refusal. They hauled planks, hammered nails, and watched men in black uniforms supervise. The carpenters worked with the same concentration they would bring to a barn, but what they built would be a barn of a different sort. Christian Worth paced the site with a stopwatch. He knew how a procedure should flow. He had supervised euthanasia centers in Germany. He had, in his own words, learned how to organize death. Now he measured distances between fences, noted the angle of sunlight through the pines, and ordered the digging of trenches where chimneys would later stand. He moved like a man who believed problems were solvable with the right sequence. His face gave nothing away. Men who worked near him would later say his presence was like a cold wind, practical, indifferent, inexorable. The technical plan was layered. There was the arrival area for trains, a siding long enough to hold several cattle wagons. There was a sorting and undressing courtyard, fenced and covered to prevent sight lines from the surrounding land. There would be wooden barracks that resembled temporary bathhouses, their interiors painted bright to avoid suspicion. The corridor, the Schlouch, would connect the undressing area to the sealed room, a narrow, fenced passage that forced people in single file, like animals herded through a chute to an abattoir. That was the architecture of deception. That was the heart of the method. The corridor shortened resistance, isolated groups, and channeled panic into compliance. Engineers experimented with insulation and ventilation in a way that would now make the blood run cold. Rubber seals, wooden linings, sand-packed walls to muffle sound. The gas chambers were framed at first, because timber was cheap and fast. Men with hammers fitted planks so tightly that you could not see a sliver of daylight through. They bored holes for pipes and left small vents to be sealed later. They tested doors that looked like ordinary washroom entrances. To an arriving deportee, these spaces had to look mundane. Paint the walls pale blue. Place a shower head as a prop. Hang a few hooks. Make the ordinary convincing, because ordinary reduces the instinct for flight. The camp had a second necessary machine, the system for stealing and sorting property. That required rooms for luggage and a team that would become adept at paperwork and theft. People were told to bring their possessions, clothes, family heirlooms, jewelry, and they brought hope in bundles. Clerks in neat shirts logged items, stamped forms, and transferred jewelry to locked boxes. The sorting rooms smelled of oil and paper and the faint metallic tang of coins. Men who were assigned to this duty sometimes kept photographs tucked in their pockets, reminders of the humanity they were erasing. Some cried in secret. Most rationalized. Papers recorded items. Ledgers kept the tally. What began as an inventory would fuel economies in Berlin and elsewhere. Then there was the issue of disposal. Cremation pits, mass graves. Early plans were pragmatic and improvised. In winter, when the ground was frozen and digging deep pits was arduous, the planners considered makeshift crematory systems, using open-air pyres and later, iron grates placed over heated pits. They thought about smoke and char, about how to spread ash so that a field might not look like a graveyard. They calculated wind directions to minimize the chance that smoke might carry into populated towns. These were technical conversations about how to hide what could not be hidden entirely. Men in coats leaned over maps, selecting where heat and scent would be least likely to betray them. In that geometry, a human being became not a person, but a variable in a sanitation problem. The site's perimeter was designed for both containment and invisibility. Fences were not high monuments of intimidation at first. They were practical barriers, topped with barbed wire in places and simple wooden slats elsewhere. Guard towers rose at vantage points where a sentry could watch for movement down the main road and scan the tree line. Each guard tower had a telephone line, so alerts could be sent quickly. Isolation bred a different kind of terror. It meant that cries, if any were heard, would travel only to fields and woods. The planners relied on the way rural life had been conditioned to look the other way. They counted on the indifference of distance. Force was organized in a choreography. SS men rehearsed movements. How to order a crowd. How to separate the elderly from the young. How to move bundles to a wagon. How to maintain the strict timetable of trains. The men in charge tested this choreography with role play. Mock arrivals where the staff practiced barking orders and the dog handlers practiced urging bodies along. They timed every sequence as if timing a factory line. Each repetition shaved seconds off a process, and in those seconds, they saw an increase in throughput. Efficiency became the measure of success. Efficiency was a moral abomination dressed in the language of management. The mechanics of the gas apparatus were improvised and cruelly simple. At first, carbon monoxide generators were employed, Engines from trucks or captured tanks adapted to feed exhaust into sealed rooms. Mechanics like Lorenz Hackenholt experimented with piping and valves, learning to seal chambers fast and to channel the deadly fumes so that they dissipated quickly after use. They recorded how long it took for a chamber to be filled, how long until silence fell, what temperatures greatly altered the process. These men tested on inanimate objects before humans. They would later refine methods that reduced the time between arrival and death, increasing capacity, but also increasing a layer of detachment for the workers. In a grim arithmetic, an engine and a pipe could be as lethal as a rifle and a firing squad, unless personally wearing on those who turn the handle. But technical planning alone could not have created what Belzec would become. There was also the psychological preparation of the staff. They practiced a vocabulary, resettlement, special treatment, disinfection, that softened the edges of what they were ordered to do. They developed routines to avoid looking directly at those they would kill, a stony countenance, averted eyes, brisk motions. Some of the men kept talismans in their pockets. Others attended mass or read prayers at night to silence the human conscience. A few drank. A few struck up small consolations with each other, jokes told in the evenings to lighten the load. These were private rituals meant to keep the machinery oiled with denial. In the camp's shadow, victims were already being processed through the channels of occupation. Lists were compiled in ghetto offices. Names were printed on tickets. Families were handed instructions. Assemble at a certain hour. Bring only what you can carry. These were acts that preserved a sliver of dignity, perhaps deliberately, to make the surrender easier. People clutched photographs and prayers as they boarded freight cars. Mothers smoothed their children's hair with hands that trembled with suppressed terror. The air in those train cars was thick with breath and the smell of stale bread, sweat, and fear. There was conversation at first. Songs hummed. A child cried. The routine on the platform at the camp's edge was meant to strip away that small human theater and replace it with administrative order. The forced laborers who worked on construction experienced a complex mixture of survival and horror. Jewish craftsmen were often pressed into building the very structures meant to kill them. They hammered and sawed with trembling hands, sometimes under direct orders from guards who reminded them they owed obedience for the chance to live. In those narrow moments, they displayed an impossible courage, shaping the doors that would later close on their people, while filing away small memories, names of coworkers, who smoked at which hour, what song someone whistled. These memories would later become testimony. Under the weight of work, small acts of kindness persisted, a shared piece of bread, a whispered warning, proof that even in the bowels of a project meant to erase humanity, humanity flickered. Local administrators were co-opted into the process. Station masters stamped schedules. Telegrapher clerks sent coded messages. A common bureaucratic language emerged that normalized atrocity through paper. Forms commanded actions and erased hesitation. One official's signature meant that a train would depart at dawn. Another's ledger entry meant that property would be collected and sent to Berlin. The banality of those acts is almost impossible to convey. Officials who had breakfast with wives and children in comfortable homes, who after signing a transport manifest might go to the theater or to a club. This double life, mundane and monstrous, was a hallmark of what the planners counted on. Security measures tightened as the site took shape. Photographers were forbidden to take pictures near the work. Only official photographers were allowed, and their film was handed over to headquarters. Rumors of reprisals discouraged loose talk. The landscape itself was both shield and witness. Footprints smoothed by wind, axe strokes covered by rain. The planners knew weather could be an ally. A snowfall covered tracks, a fog hid movement. They watched forecasts with the same attention they gave to trains. A wet afternoon might be perfect for a shipment because no one would notice smoke or the sound of stacking timber. By March 1942, the wooden structures were largely in place. The Schlouch ran like a tight river between the undressing yard and the sealed chambers. There were rooms for the collection of property, benches for shaving and disrobing, and the first small exhaust systems tested and retested by mechanic teams. The camp looked, from a distance, like a cluster of temporary depots. Close up, it hummed with a confined energy. Men in uniforms moved with purpose. Dogs padded along fences. Voices barked commands in clipped German. In the dark, one could sometimes hear the distant clatter of tools and the occasional burst of laughter. Low, dissonant, human sounds trying to survive among the timbers of construction. Yet even as the planners celebrated the near completion of their work, not everyone was certain the system would hold. There were technical doubts. Would the seals fail in wet weather? Would the smoke from cremation pits alert nearby villages? Would the local population notice the steady flow of trains? More than technical doubts, however, lurked small moral scruples in the souls of a few individuals. A carpenter who wondered if the door he just hammered would close for the last time on a child. A clerk who, for a moment, hesitated before stamping a ledger. Those hesitations were quiet and rare, and mostly swallowed by the louder rhythms of orders. But they were there, like small cracks in a dam that seemed otherwise unbreachable. As the frost melted and March edged toward spring, the planners performed final rehearsals. Guards learned to coordinate with telegraph offices. Mechanics timed the engine's startup sequences. Clerks practiced the inventory of belongings. The engineers ran air tests in the chambers and noted with precise cynicism the time to unconsciousness at different temperatures. They marked the blueprints with adjustments. The camp, in these last days before operation, felt like a clock about to be wound. At night, in the small billets where the staff slept, men wrote letters that would never be sent. They scratched notes by dim lamps and sealed them as if sealing secrets. The volunteers for the arrival teams adjusted boots and counted cartridges not for war, but for control. Some tried to sleep. Others sat and drank and exchanged small talismans of bravado. Outside, the woods breathed and a fox crept along the perimeter, unbothered by the human industry. Nature carried on with a timeless and indifferent rhythm that would, paradoxically, be the last witness to what would happen here. And then the timetables came. They arrived scribbled in black ink from Lublin. Train numbers, arrival windows, the expected head count. The planners felt, for a moment, a cold satisfaction. The machine they had built would now be fed. There was a technical pride in seeing plans translated into schedules. But beneath the pride, beneath the meticulous joy of a system ready to run, there was also a chill, a recognition that the next phase would change the site from cold logistics into a chamber of irrevocable human loss. The tools were ready. The men were ready. The blueprint had become timber and wire and road. On the day the first train was scheduled, the camp stood like a patient at the edge of a scalpel, prepared, sterile in its timber and sawdust, waiting for incision. Hammers fell silent. Men checked watches. A hush, taut as a string, stretched across the grounds. The plan that had been drawn in pencil and sealed in file folders would now be put to the test. Would the rehearsed choreography hold? Would the engines perform as predicted? Would the human material flow without disruption? No one could know then how the small decisions of blueprint and plank, how the angle of a fence, the placement of vent, the tone of a guard's voice, would shape the fate of thousands. The camp, once an abstract diagram, was about to become an instrument of history. The whistle had not yet blown, but the smell of sawdust and engine oil and the distant scent of coal smoke were already in the air, gathering like a prophecy. Chapter 4. Opening the Gas. The First Phase of Killing. March, June 1942. The first whistle was not a warning so much as an ordinary sound on an ordinary morning. A train letting off steam at the siding, metal on metal, a long, slow breath. To the men in charge, it was the satisfying note of a machine beginning to move. To the people inside the freight cars, it was a clatter that meant uncertain travel, a shaking that mixed nausea and hope. They pressed faces to slatted wood and breathed the stale air, listening for a station that might bring food, a new home, a reunion. They could not know how closely their lives had been measured and scheduled on distant desks, nor how quickly the margin between ordinary and annihilation could be closed. The first days at Belzec were a test, not of ideology, but of mechanics. The wooden gas chambers, built in haste because timber was available and speed was essential, were not yet the brick and iron structures that would come later. They were crude, sturdy, insulated boxes, lined with planks and sealed with felt and sand. Men with hammers and a grim, focused nail doors that were closed forever. They installed pipes and tried valves. Mechanics adapted truck engines as crude carbon monoxide generators, running hoses and checking seals in the early hours, watching for leaks and any sign of failure. They ran tests on empty rooms first, then bundles of straw, then, later, on living bodies that the system had been designed to extinguish. Each test taught them something they would apply to human beings. Arrival procedures were choreographed to minimize confusion. The train would draw in and stop. Guards walked the platform as a performance of authority. Men shouted in clipped German. Dogs barked. Orderlies from the camp, men who had been prepared for this task, moved with cold efficiency. People were forced out of the cattle wagons in groups, pushed by rifle butts and hands. There was panic. There were quiet faces. There was the sudden, bright terror of mothers clutching infants. A man held a photograph to his chest. A woman smoothed a child's hair as if smoothing a garment, steadying something she could no longer protect. Deception was central. The camp had been designed to look like a place of temporary processing. The undressing area smelled of straw and soap. Benches were set up. A few crude, washing signs were painted to suggest an ordinary sanitary routine. People were told they were being disinfected and resettled. The promise, thin and obscene, worked because it resembled other wartime commands that had not ended in violence. Humans will often accept small lies to survive the terror of unknowns. That willingness to believe made the work of the killers easier. The slouch, the narrow passage, funneled people like water through a pipe. The design minimized resistance. It turned confusion into submission. Inside, the clerks did their appointed labor. They recorded names when names were demanded, scratched numbers on forms, and collected jewelry and papers in boxes that would feed distant warehouses. The muffled clink of metal, rings, bracelets, watches, was a sound that bureaucrats would later note with numbness, as if inventorying spoils rather than the lives those things once circled. Labor that had once been honest, counting, marking, filing, became a part of the murder machine. Each ledger entry erased a person. Each stamped ticket eased the pathway to silence. The actual killing, when it began in earnest, had a quality of hurried improvisation. The first transports were not always handled seamlessly. Hiccups occurred. Doors that stuck, seals that failed, an engine that sputtered. Mechanics cursed under breath and adjusted hoses. Sometimes, after a chaotic and anguished scene, the process slowed because the wood warped in damp weather, or because men inexperienced in such work hesitated at the final moment. Each delay produced screams, and for the workers the sound was a problem to be muted, a logistical nuisance. They learned, acutely and rapidly, how to speed things up. This was the cruel calculus, how to maintain throughput while suppressing the messy reality of killing. The role of certain men became crucial in these early months. Mechanics like Lorenz Hackenholt, who had been involved with earlier euthanasia operations, worked like technicians at a plant, altering piping, inventing faster seals, calibrating engines to produce the right concentration of exhaust. They kept notebooks, recorded times, and compared results. Their notes are a terrifying kind of data, sterile in form, but savage in effect. What reads like maintenance log becomes a record of how human air was displaced, how consciousness slipped away. In the margins of a mechanic's log, you find the outline of a human's final minutes measured in seconds. For the condemned, those minutes had a texture beyond numbers. In the cold wooden rooms, the air grew heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and the tang of fear. People waited in the dark, breathing fast, clutching each other, whispering prayers or last jokes to excuse the panic. A child whimpered. An old man tried to hum a lullaby. Some sang together, in a last grasp at defiance or comfort. The sound of their voices hit the ear differently inside the chamber. Close, intimate, terrible. The gas crept in like invisible fog. Faces slackened. Eyes rolled. Movement slowed. Later, when the door opened and the executioners looked in, they would describe a heap of limbs, the quiet of a sudden winter. For them, this was efficiency. For the victims, it was the extinguishing of stories. Disposal of bodies posed another set of problems in spring months. The original solution, digging pits and burying, was inadequate and slow, especially as warmer weather accelerated decomposition and the stench multiplied. Open-air pyres were tested. Men arranged timber on iron grids and fed bodies into flames. Smoke rose into the pine sky, but the planners tried to manage it, control its direction, mix it with chimney smoke, even time burnings for windy days. They developed techniques for breaking bones and crushing ashes to make them less obvious. The ground itself became part of the process. Ash spread and mixed with soil, bones hidden in pits, trenches covered, then covered again. There was a grim ingenuity to the methods, an almost engineering pride in solutions that masked the scale of atrocity. Survivors are rare from these first months, but those who did live to tell pieces of the story described not only the terror, but the small human behaviors that persisted. People hid letters in clothes pockets, sewn into seams. They whispered names again and again so someone might remember. They left small marks, a folded piece of cloth, a hair lock tied in a scarf, knowing that even if they would not survive, it might be evidence of existence. These tokens were defiant acts of self-assertion in a system determined to reduce humans to numbers. The men who organized the killings sometimes scoffed at these gestures. Other times they collected them in boxes, piles of human detritus that later made their way back into bureaucratic inventories. The psychological effect on the staff hardened quickly. For many of the SS men and Trauniki auxiliaries, the first experiences produced a numbness that became a protective shell. They learned to avert their eyes, to say the standardized commands, to see bodies as loads or material. Even the dog handlers, who had to provoke and herd people, became desensitized. Where laughter had once punctuated a meal, now there were furtive jokes and a crude bravado meant to cover the tremors under their steadiness. A handful of individuals felt revulsion and tried to step away. These men were often pushed aside or reassigned. The system rewarded the ones who continued. There were, however, moments that slipped through the veil of routine and exposed some men's private disquiet. Kurt Gerstein, for example, would later recount with horror the sights he witnessed and tried desperately to report them. Others, less famous, left small traces of unease. A diary entry smudged with tears, a letter home full of banalities that masked a different reality. But with every technical improvement and every successful transport, the institutional momentum reinforced denial. The camp's engines purred. Schedules held. The men in gray files nodded and signed off. The killing could proceed faster. Another layer of cruelty unfolded in the handling of the dead. Sorting teams, made up of prisoners forced to work under threat of death, were compelled to strip bodies of valuables, cut hair, extract gold teeth. They moved like automatons, working under whips, their hands stained with the labor of erasing identity. After the initial period, these Sonderkommandos were themselves executed and replaced in cycles meant to eliminate witnesses. The cold calculus of rotation ensured that those who had been forced to touch the dead would not outlive the secret. This built-in erasure extended the camp's design. Leave no testimony from those who had handled the remains. The local population reacted in a spectrum of ways. Peasants noticed smoke and occasionally smelled the acrid tang of burning. Some kept distance, fearful or indifferent or simply unable to comprehend. Others were dragged into the process as laborers, hired to trench or cart away ash under supervision. A few risked more, trying to listen for names, collect rumors, or hide small items left behind. These acts were dangerous and rare. The planners relied on this isolation. The camp's remoteness and the fear of reprisals from SS patrols kept many tongues closed. As spring gave way to early summer, the operation at Belzec settled into a grim rhythm. Trains came and went. The wooden gas chambers were used extensively and with increasing efficiency. Men who had been unsure at the beginning adapted to the demands of timing and secrecy. They optimized the space, reduced handling times, and increased throughput. They built schedules like factory managers, designing shifts for guards and mechanics, planning the rotation of prisoners forced into the worst tasks, and mapping the routes for transporting property. The camp's development was a perverse form of productivity. The managers took satisfaction in seeing their system perform. At the same time, failures continued. Timber warped in damp weather. Engines failed. Guards made mistakes. When mistakes happened, the result could be chaos. Panic might erupt, and panic could be contagious. Yet, even failures taught the killers lessons. They documented errors and amended their blueprints. They learned to expect human unpredictability and to design around it. The more systematically they could respond to variables, the more nearly foolproof the system seemed. This relentless iteration, try, fail, improve, made the camp increasingly lethal. By June 1942, the first phase at Belzec had proved both horrifying and instructive to the architects of Operation Reinhard. The wooden chambers had shown that systematic, concealed killing was possible at a scale the Einsatzgruppen shootings had never matched, if the machinery could be kept running. Reports went back to Lublin and Berlin. The throughput numbers, the logistical notes, the problems and their solutions. The planners assimilated the knowledge and prepared to adapt it elsewhere. In short order, lessons learned from Belzec's early months would be applied to other sites, improving design, increasing efficiency, and deepening the machinery of extermination. But those dry reports obscured human ruin. Each ledger line hid names, and behind names, lives, voices, faces. The camp's tally books, its telegraphs, its maintenance logs would later be used as evidence. But at the moment, they were instruments of policy and concealment. The men who sent the dispatches could measure tonnage and time, but not the moral geography they had reshaped. They wrote in the language of schedules. They did not speak of ash and grief. As summer pressed in and the pine trees leaned close like sentinels to hide their complicity, the camp's operators took stock. They saw what worked, what needed to be improved, and how best to keep the operation invisible to the wider world. New plans were already being sketched. Brick chambers to replace wood, more efficient engines, improved ventilation systems, and better strategies for disposing of remains in a way that would not betray their crimes. Technical refinement was the order of business, and the men who craved order welcomed it. The first phase was ending, but not because the work had been completed with a conscience. It was ending because the engineers had gathered the data they needed to refine the process. They had learned when to schedule transports, how to manage the logistics of human property, and how to mask the sensory evidence of murder. In those months, the blueprints were revised. The sketches became hardened plans. Belzec had been a field laboratory, and the experiment had yielded results. And among the scattered remnants, hidden letters, swallowed prayers, the few who escaped to tell fragments, there was the human witness that the planners desperately tried to obliterate. These shards of memory would later pierce the official narratives. For now, though, the camp hummed with its work. The engines idled. The guards sharpened routines. The clerks penciled in numbers. The train whistles kept their ordinary cadence. People continued to arrive. People continued to vanish. The first phase at Belzec had shown the world, in shadow, a new method of mass murder. Fast, secretive, and bureaucratically efficient. It had taught the killers how to turn timber and engines into instruments of extinction. It had revealed the cruel truth that modern organization could be harnessed to unfathomable ends. And as the planners folded their maps and sent their reports further up the chain, one enormous question remained unsettled. Could any system designed to keep its work secret survive the persistence of truth? The answer would come, not in documents or blueprints, but in smoke and testimony and the stubborn work of memory. Chapter 5, Scaling the System. Rebuilding the Gas Chambers, July 1942. The summer air was thick with heat and rot when Christian Worth returned to Belzec. He stood on the rise above the camp and looked down at the wooden gas chambers that had already begun to sag. The timber swelled in humidity, the doors warped, and the smell from the pits carried far beyond the fences. The ground itself betrayed them. Too soft, too shallow, too alive. What was meant to stay hidden had begun to speak through the soil. Worth understood that efficiency could not depend on weather or decay. The system had to evolve. The first phase of killing had revealed every weakness of their creation. Wooden walls that absorbed stench, engines that failed, graves that leaked through the earth after rain. The camp's operators learned through failure, and failure here meant chaos. Confusion among guards, exposure to disease, the unbearable sight of bodies not yet consumed by fire. Bureaucracy demanded results, not disorder. And so, by mid-1942, the camp became a construction site again. Only this time, its purpose was refinement. The old wooden chambers were torn down piece by piece. Prisoners were forced to dismantle the structures they once feared, carrying planks still stained by what they'd witnessed. Each strike of a hammer echoed through the camp like an accusation. The guards barked orders. The air was filled with dust and memory. Within days, the remnants were gone, and in their place rose something more permanent, more precise, and infinitely more monstrous. A brick building, the new heart of Belzec. This new structure was designed not as a makeshift experiment, but as a machine. 6 chambers instead of 3, each connected by a corridor that allowed movement in sequence. The walls were thicker, lined with mortar, designed to trap both gas and sound. The floors sloped slightly toward drains to ease the washing of blood and fluids. Metal doors replaced wooden ones, fitted with rubber seals to keep in pressure and silence. Small glass peepholes, set at head height, allowed SS men to watch the process without entering. A cold innovation from the lessons of T4. The builders worked quickly, under the eye of Worth and the supervision of a man named Lorenz Hackenholt, who had been transferred from his mechanical duties to oversee construction and operation. Hackenholt moved between the crews like a foreman at a factory, inspecting masonry, testing hinges, and checking ventilation shafts. He spoke in the dry, precise tone of an engineer, not a murderer. To him, this was a problem to be solved. How to kill more people in less time, with less effort. The new gas system was powered by larger engines, captured Soviet tank motors mounted outside the chamber walls. Exhaust pipes fed directly into each sealed room through reinforced valves. Mechanics tested the engines for hours, listening to the idle hum, timing the flow of gas. They wrote down notes in neat script. Air pressure, temperature, time to fulfill. In another life, it could have been an experiment in industrial ventilation. Here, it was the science of extinction. The commandant's barracks received upgrades too. Offices were refurbished with telephones and filing cabinets. Reports from Berlin had to be recorded meticulously. How many transports, how many arrived, how many processed. The very language of reporting was abstracted. The words processed and dispatched replaced killed. Each death became a unit, a statistic that could be charted. Bureaucracy turned human lives into math, and in that math, murder became a routine calculation. As construction advanced, the camp's organization shifted. A new railway siding was built to allow trains to pull directly inside the perimeter fence. No longer would passengers disembark in view of the countryside. The entire arrival process, the disrobing, the sorting, the killing, would occur within the closed system of the camp itself. The goal was invisibility. No outside eyes. No survivors. No noise beyond the barbed wire. Worth ordered the planting of young pine trees along the perimeter, a green camouflage that would grow to hide the smoke columns rising from the cremation pits. Paths were covered in sand to muffle footsteps. Signs with bureaucratic euphemisms, bath and disinfection, were placed in plain view. The deception was both psychological and operational. The smoother the illusion, the faster the process. Fear was a variable that slowed efficiency, and efficiency was the only goal left that mattered. The prisoners forced to build the new chambers knew exactly what they were making. Their faces were hollow, their movements mechanical. They spoke little, communicating with glances, sometimes exchanging whispers in Yiddish when guards were out of earshot. Each brick they laid was another small betrayal of their will to live, but survival, even for a few more days, demanded obedience. Some left marks hidden in the walls, a name scratched in a mortar, a prayer etched with a nail. Those marks would not be found until decades later. When a new building was finished, it looked ordinary. A low brick structure with a sloped roof, painted to resemble a storage facility. The front doors were wooden, polished, unremarkable. There was no smoke, no blood, no overt sign of its purpose. But inside, every detail was tuned to serve the rhythm of killing. The corridor between the chambers allowed one group to die while another entered. The sequence could continue uninterrupted, like an assembly line of annihilation. The first tests of the new chambers took place in July. The victims were Polish Jews from nearby ghettos, the test subjects of an industrial process disguised as deportation. The train arrived at dawn. Orders were shouted. Luggage piled in heaps. People were told, as always, that they were going to be cleaned and sent to work. The first group was led through the corridor, and the doors closed behind them. Outside, Hackenholt started the tank engine. It sputtered, caught, and roared. Inside, the lights flickered and the air thickened. The watchers peered through the glass ports, counting minutes. 7, 10, 15. Then silence. When the doors opened, the scene was chaos frozen in stillness. The first victims had clawed at the walls, leaving gouges and plaster. Faces were distorted, mouths open. The sight forced some guards to step back, gagging on the smell of gas and death. But Wirth did not flinch. He made notes. He timed the process. He instructed that the gas flow be adjusted to increase pressure, to make the deaths quicker and cleaner. Killing, to him, was a matter of calibration. The success of a new system was measured in output. Transports increased. Trains came from Lublin, Lvov, Krakow, Tarnow, sometimes 2 or 3 per day. Each carried hundreds of people, and each would vanish into the camp without leaving a single living soul behind. The rhythm became mechanical: arrival, deception, stripping, herding, gassing, disposal. Each stage was timed and repeated. By late summer, the operation ran with the smoothness of a conveyor belt. In Berlin, officials read the reports with satisfaction. Belzec was performing its function beyond expectations. It had become a model for the next camps, Sobibor and Treblinka, whose designs would directly copy its layout and its gas system. Christian Wirth himself would be promoted, becoming inspector of all Operation Reinhard camps. The men who had built this place were now experts in the art of organized killing. They called themselves logisticians, administrators, specialists. They were none of those things. They were executioners hidden behind desks. Inside the camp, the human toll defied imagination. Bodies piled faster than they could be burned or buried. Even with cremation pits constantly burning, the air filled with ash that settled like gray snow over the trees. The smell was everywhere, oily, sweet, unbearable. Guards tried to mask it with lime, with smoke from fires, with excuses. But you could not disguise the odor of civilization rotting in real time. The Jewish laborers assigned to burial duty worked in shifts that never ended. They hauled bodies from the chambers, dragging them by limbs, stacking them in pits, sprinkling sand and chlorine between layers. Some whispered the Shema under their breath as they worked, not out of hope but defiance, a prayer for the dead said among the dead. At night, when the guards drank and boasted, the laborers huddled in corners, too exhausted to speak, their eyes reflecting firelight. They knew their turn would come soon. Disease began to spread among the laborers, and even the guards grew uneasy. Flies clustered on the fences. Rats scurried through the trenches. Wirth ordered quicklime dumped in pits, then ordered cremations intensified. The fires burned day and night, the smoke rising through pine needles, drifting east across the Lublin plains. Villagers miles away spoke of a smell like tar and burnt sugar. Some guessed at what it was. Most chose not to know. By August, Belzec had transformed from a crude killing site into a fully functioning death factory. The wooden chambers of spring were gone. The brick complex stood like an institution, silent, methodical. The camp could now process thousands per day, and the SS staff spoke in the same detached tone they used to describe production quotas. They drank in the evenings, played cards, told jokes. The sound of laughter mingled with the low hum of engines and the crackle of fire. But beneath this mechanical rhythm, the strain was visible. Guards grew irritable, quick to violence. Some drowned their thoughts in alcohol. A few wrote home to wives, describing the camp as hard work, without details. The human soul cannot live in endless denial without corrosion. And here, the corrosion was visible in twitching hands, nervous laughter, dead eyes. Yet the system itself, the system they served, allowed no hesitation. There was always another train coming. The efficiency of Belzec in these months would become its own undoing. The constant inflow of transports overwhelmed even its improved facilities. Ash and remains accumulated faster than they could be scattered. The graves swelled and cracked, releasing gases that made the soil bubble and the air shimmer. By late summer, the ground moved with a breath of decomposition. The SS feared discovery. Worth ordered new layers of soil, dumped over the pits, and the fences extended farther into the woods. Still, the earth refused to keep the secret. In Berlin, Operation Reinhard headquarters noted the problem and issued orders for alternative disposal. They were already thinking ahead, of exhumation, of cremation, of the destruction of evidence. Belzec had shown them both the power and the peril of industrialized murder. They would improve the process again, as they always did. By September, the camp had reached the height of its killing capacity. The new chambers ran daily. The engines rarely stopped. At full operation, more than 15,000 people could be killed in a single week. The numbers are difficult to comprehend, but to the men at their desks, they were clean figures, devoid of pain. To those inside the chambers, each second was an eternity. The fires burned brightest at dusk, when the last transports of the day arrived. In that glow, the camp looked almost tranquil from a distance. The soft hum of engines, the flicker of flame, the muted rhythm of footsteps. But within that silence lay the heartbeat of organized evil, steady and unstoppable. As autumn approached, the commanders gathered for inspection. They walked the perimeter, noted the efficiency of the new system, the discipline of the guards, the smoothness of operation. Worth received congratulations. Hackenholt was praised for mechanical ingenuity. The camp was now a prototype, a success in the eyes of its creators. They spoke of statistics, of transport quotas, of expansion. None spoke of the hundreds of thousands already gone. The world outside remained unaware. The victims' voices were ash. The ground absorbed the truth, the trees whispered smoke, and the wind carried a story no one was ready to hear. Belzec, reborn in brick and steel, had become something unprecedented, the first true death camp of Operation Reinhard. From its chimneys rose not just smoke, but the blueprint of genocide perfected. And yet, even as the engines roared and the paperwork flowed, a new problem began to surface, one that would haunt its architects. The secrecy they prized was crumbling. Whispers were spreading through occupied Poland, reaching ears in Krakow, Warsaw, even beyond the borders. Trains left and never returned. Towns emptied overnight. The silence after each deportation became too vast to ignore. Inside the camp, the walls of the new chambers dripped with condensation and soot, and the men who had built them could not sleep. They had created a monster that consumed everything: lives, air, even the sanity of those who fed it. Belzec was now perfect and damned. And as the final weeks of summer turned to autumn, Christian Worth's gaze turned eastward. The next phase was already planned. Sobibor would rise next, then Treblinka. The model was ready, the method tested. Belzec had served its purpose, the perfection of death, as a process. But perfection demands its own destruction. For even the most efficient machine leaves traces, and in time, those traces would tell the story its creators wanted buried forever. The smoke still hung over the trees, the soil still shifted, and the wind still carried the echo of those who had vanished. The system had been scaled, refined, and perfected, and yet, in its very efficiency, it carried the seed of its exposure, a secret too vast to stay buried beneath Polish earth. Chapter 6. The Machinery of Deception. The morning light fell over Belzec in a way that could almost deceive the eye. From a distance, it looked ordinary, quiet even, like an industrial compound hidden between pine and smoke. The fences were neat, the gravel paths raked smooth, the roofs glinted faintly with dew. Nothing about it declared what it truly was. That was by design. Everything here was about deception, the lies that made murder possible, the theater that disguised extinction as procedure. By the summer of 1942, this machinery of deceit was as finely tuned as the gas chambers themselves. Every piece of illusion served a function. The signs at the gate bore the words transit camp and disinfection area. The buildings were arranged like administrative offices, not like instruments of death. Even the guards' behavior was deliberate. When a transport arrived, they shouted orders not in fury but in the brisk, detached tone of railway officials. Calm created control, and control made the process efficient. To the prisoners stepping out of the freight cars, the atmosphere was confusing but not immediately terrifying. They had been on the train for days, hungry, exhausted, unsure. Some clutched documents or family letters. Others carried sacks of clothing. They had been told they were being resettled. The smell of smoke from the cremation pits was strange, but could be mistaken for industrial burning or cooking fires. Human hope, the cruelest resource of all, was still alive in them. The deception began before arrival. From the ghettos of Lublin, Krakow, and Lvov, German officials issued orders printed on formal stationery, stamped and signed. Resettlement to the east, they called it. Families were told to register, to bring identification, currency, and no more than 15 kilograms of luggage. The instruction to bring money and valuables gave the lie its power. People do not bring jewelry to their execution. And so they came. They boarded the trains under the eyes of guards who used the same routines they would for any population transfer. Even the station masters believed, or pretended to believe, the deportations were temporary. The truth moved only in whispers. When the trains reached Belzec, the procedure began like a ritual. The guards opened the doors with practiced motions, shouting, "Raus! Schnell!" but not in the frenzied cruelty of an open massacre. The first impression was order, not chaos. Men and women stumbled out, blinking into sunlight. The ground beneath their feet was firm and tamped, not muddy. A small platform bore a sign in German and Polish, "Reception." The illusion of process was vital. Disorder meant fear, and fear meant delay. An SS officer, sometimes Worth himself, sometimes his deputy, addressed the crowd with calm authority. "You are being taken to a labor camp. Before you continue, you must bathe and have your clothes disinfected. Your possessions will be returned after disinfection." These were the words repeated daily, the words that turned disbelief into submission. To lend credence to the story, a narrow path led to wooden sheds labeled bathhouse. From the outside, the buildings looked like any field sanitation station. The deception was multi-layered. Prisoners were divided by gender under the pretense of cleanliness. Men to one side, women and children to another. Guards collected their luggage, placing number tags on sacks. The numbers were meaningless, but they mimicked bureaucracy, orderliness that gave people the illusion their belongings would be stored and retrieved. In reality, the sorting barracks beyond the fence buzzed with clerks and soldiers rifling through pockets, cutting linings, pulling out hidden coins, rings, and gold teeth. Belzec was not just a death camp. It was a scavenging engine that stripped bodies of everything material before destroying the evidence. Hairdressers were part of the deception too. Women were told their hair would be cut for hygiene before bathing. In truth, the shorn hair was packed in bags and sent to factories in Germany for use in mattresses and cloth. Even this horror was catalogued, weighed, and shipped with invoices. The prisoners never knew. They laughed nervously as scissors snipped around their ears, believing it a mundane step in a bureaucratic process. Children giggled, mistaking the shears for play. Their mothers smiled weakly to calm them. The calmness itself made the killings easier. Along the corridor known as the Schlouch, the tube, the final deception began. This narrow passage, fenced with branches and lined with flowers, was meant to look like a garden walkway. A sign overhead read, "To the showers." The illusion was so precise it mocked belief itself. Flowers, real and fake, were arranged along the fence. A few birch trees were planted to hide the walls. The floor was covered with sand to muffle footsteps. The victims walked in single file, clutching towels or soap given to them by the guards. At the entrance to the gas chambers, a Star of David was painted above the doorway. It was the ultimate act of mockery, religion turned into camouflage for annihilation. Inside, the air was dim and close. The chambers were painted white, with imitation showerheads fixed to the ceiling. No pipes connected them. No water ever flowed. The deception was total. People stepped inside, believing they were moments away from cleansing bath. Mothers lifted children to reassure them. Old men folded their coats neatly, out of habit. When the heavy metal door slammed shut and the bolt slid into place, there was a moment of stunned confusion, a second or two when they still expected water. Then came the sound of engines rumbling outside, the faint hiss through the vents, the tightening of air. The deception ended in that breathless instant when realization struck too late. For the men who operated the camp, deception was not merely a tactic. It was a shield against conscience. To deceive the victims was to preserve themselves. They could tell themselves they were not butchers, but administrators. They could tell themselves they were maintaining order, performing duty. The distance between truth and lie was the space where humanity had been evacuated. In that space, men became functionaries of death. Even after the chambers emptied, the illusion continued. The bodies were dragged out, but the floors were washed, the walls scrubbed, the doors left open to dry. The next group would not smell death, only the faint odor of disinfectant. Every trace of panic was erased. The prisoners forced to clean the chambers were under orders to be thorough. Any sign of blood or vomit might break the spell for the next transport. They worked in silence, their faces pale with exhaustion, knowing their own lives would end soon. Beyond the killing zone, another performance unfolded daily. At the sorting barracks, German clerks and Ukrainian guards sifted through belongings, laughing as they found valuables. A man's photograph was tossed aside, his child's toy pocketed as a curiosity. Gold teeth were pried from corpses by men with pliers, melted down, and stored in jars. The economy of murder flourished quietly. In official documents, these were listed as recovered materials. Even cruelty had become an entry in a ledger. Worth and his officers refined their choreography constantly. Too much shouting created panic. Too little force caused confusion. The perfect balance was a tone of sterile professionalism, the look of control without overt brutality. Worth described it as a humane approach, using the word with monstrous irony. He instructed his men to smile when addressing victims, to reassure them until the very last step. He knew that despair was contagious, that fear could ripple through a crowd and create chaos. Order was the soul of the system. The deception extended to the outside world. Railway reports listed Belzec as a transit station. Local officials received paperwork describing labor transfers. Even within the SS hierarchy, few men outside Operation Reinhard knew precisely what occurred there. The camp existed as a ghost, an administrative fiction that consumed real lives. Trains went in, empty cars came out, and the paperwork balanced neatly. In the mathematics of bureaucracy, there was no room for questions. As months passed, the system's refinement became grotesque in its elegance. Guards developed routines that minimized emotional friction. They avoided looking directly into faces. They refer to transports by numbers, not names. They drank after work, exchanging dark humor to drown what humanity remained. Deception had become mutual. They deceived the victims and themselves. The illusion of necessity, of professionalism, insulated them from the truth of what they did. But even in the machinery of deceit, cracks appeared. Some victims recognized the smell of gas or the rising smoke. There were moments of panic when crowds resisted, sensing doom. Then the masks fell, and the guards reverted to open violence. Gunfire erupted. Dogs tore at fleeing figures. The calm veneer shattered. Yet after every outbreak, the system corrected itself. Procedures were reviewed, orders rewritten. The next train would arrive, and the deception would begin again as if nothing had happened. The local villagers near Belzec learned to read the signs. The air would tremble with the rumble of trains at dawn. The wind would shift with the smell of burning, and then silence would fall again by night. They spoke in whispers of a place where people vanished. Some said it was a factory for soap. Others guessed the truth, but lacked words to describe it. The deception that cloaked the camp extended into the very fabric of their lives. Fear, rumor, silence. The machine of murder relied on the complicity of disbelief. In Berlin, the deception was perfected through language. Reports spoke of special treatment and evacuation. Numbers were tallied without names. The code words were understood by those who needed to know, ignored by those who preferred not to. The bureaucratic mind could function cleanly, detached from the stench and the screams. In ink and typewriter font, genocide became administration. Every day at Belzec was a repetition of the same performance. The arrival of trains, the speeches, the sorting, the false showers. Every day the same words echoed. It's only disinfection. You will be safe soon. Leave your belongings here. The machinery of deception needed to be constant because routine bred trust. The more ordinary the process appeared, the more smoothly it ran. It was evil disguised as efficiency, murder masquerading as management. In this theater of lies, there was one audience that could not be fooled: the earth itself. The soil grew saturated with what it was forced to hold. Rainwater turned gray with ash. The air thickened. No matter how carefully the SS men constructed their illusions, the natural world betrayed them. Birds circled the site and then fled. Vegetation wilted where graves had been dug. The ground itself rebelled against the lie. Still, the deception continued. When foreign visitors passed through the region, the camp was described as an agricultural project. The barbed wire was hidden with fresh paint, the guard towers disguised with branches. In photographs, Belzec appeared ordinary, an unremarkable compound in the woods. The visual illusion was complete. By late 1942, deception had become so embedded in the system that even the participants no longer knew where the lie ended. Some of the younger guards, recruited later, believed they were part of a resettlement program until they saw too much. They drank themselves numb. Others, like Worth, had long ceased to see the distinction between truth and efficiency. The lie had become the world itself. And so the trains kept coming. Families from across occupied Poland continued to believe they were being moved for work. Rabbis carried Torah scrolls. Mothers brought loaves of bread. Children held toys. They stepped into a lie so perfect that only at its final moment did the truth reveal itself, in the suffocating dark of a sealed chamber. When the engines roared to life and the exhaust filled the rooms, there were no more words. Only the mechanical hum of deceit fulfilled. Outside, the guards smoked, the clerks filled out forms, and another transport was marked processed. The machinery of deception had done its work, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. But even perfect lies leave residue. Years later, when the camp was gone and the grass grew over the pits, the faint traces of the deception remained: metal tags, glass fragments, human hair woven into soil. Proof that the theater of falsehood had once stood here, and that behind every bureaucratic phrase, and every painted sign was a scream too large to contain. The machinery of deception was not only the camouflage of Belzec, it was the very essence of how the Holocaust functioned. Lies layered upon lies, until the truth disappeared under paperwork, euphemism, and the ordinary gestures of men pretending to serve order. And in the ruins of that pretense, when the last transport rolled away, the silence that followed was its final act, a quiet so complete that for decades, the world almost believed the lie itself. Chapter 7. The Command and the Guards. The power at Belzec did not lie in grand speeches or medals. It lay in the quiet gestures of men who had long stopped asking questions. They wore uniforms that looked almost ordinary: gray-green field jackets, black boots, caps tilted just so, but behind their eyes was the dull light of men who had learned to live inside obedience. Every order here carried the weight of death, and every man who gave or followed those orders had to build a wall inside himself to survive the sound of what he was doing. The command structure at Belzec was not vast. It was small, efficient, and terrifyingly effective, because every man within it understood that his job was to make murder feel like routine. At the top stood Christian Worth, the inspector and architect of death, a man whose face could have been carved from the same granite he had once used to build roads. He had begun his career as a policeman, a man obsessed with procedure and precision, traits that had served him well in the earlier T for euthanasia program. At Belzec, those same traits were weaponized. He was not a ranting ideologue. He was a man of habit, a bureaucrat of killing who believed chaos was weakness. When he walked through the camp, the guards stood straighter. He carried no visible cruelty in his step, but behind that rigid calm was a cold belief that what he did was necessary. He called the prisoners units. He called the gas chambers installations. He called the killings operations. Under him were the officers who translated his orders into daily action. Men like Gottlieb Herring, who would later take command of the camp, and Lorenz Hackenholt, the mechanic who made the gas chambers function with clockwork precision. Hackenholt, known to the men as Hacko, was both technician and executioner. His hands were perpetually streaked with oil, his uniform smelled of exhaust, and his temper was short. But Worth trusted him because he was efficient. Hackenholt had no grand ideology. He was a worker, proud of his mechanical mastery. He would test engines, adjust valves, time the deaths, and record results in his logbook. He saw his work as a technical challenge. The morality of it never entered his calculations. There was also Joseph Oberhauser, Worth's adjutant and enforcer, a man who understood both paperwork and punishment. He was the camp's organizer of cruelty, ensuring that orders were followed to the letter. If a prisoner looked too long at a guard, Oberhauser noticed. If a task lagged, Oberhauser's voice would cut through the air like steel. He believed in hierarchy, in the purity of chain of command. Men like him made Belzec function not through charisma, but through terror disguised as discipline. The guards themselves were a strange mixture, some German SS, others Ukrainian auxiliaries trained at the Troniki camp. The Ukrainians wore mismatched uniforms, some in faded Wehrmacht gray, others in captured Soviet tunics. Their loyalty was born not of ideology, but survival. Many were former prisoners of war, offered a grim bargain: serve the Germans or die in the camps. They chose service. The SS treated them with contempt, but relied on them utterly. They manned the towers, patrolled the fences, and handled the victims up close. They were the hands that dragged, pushed, struck, and shot. For every calculated command given from an office, it was a Ukrainian rifle, but that enforced it. The relationship between the SS and the Ukrainian guards was uneasy, bound by fear and necessity. The SS called them volunteers, but the word was another lie. These men were trapped in a circle of complicity. Disobedience meant death, and obedience meant living with what they did. Many drank heavily, their pay spent on schnapps brought from local villages. Drunkenness dulled the edge of what they saw each day. When the engines roared and screams rose from the chambers, some of them sang to drown out the noise. Others laughed, trying to turn horror into humor. At night, they gathered in the barracks, gambling, shouting, pretending that they were far from the place where ash fell like snow on the pine trees outside. The SS staff was small, barely more than 20 men, but they commanded the power of an army. Their names, now scattered through post-war records, were once spoken in low tones among the prisoners who served in the work details. Fritz German, Reinhold Feeks, Heinrich Ley, and a handful of others filled the ranks. They rotated duties, one day supervising the undressing area, another guarding the rail ramp, another overseeing the disposal pits. The monotony of death was broken only by minor variations in task. Their ranks were not high. Few of them would ever rise beyond sergeant. But within the wired perimeter of Belzec, they wielded absolute authority. Life for the guards followed a rhythm that, in its regularity, made the camp's purpose feel disturbingly normal. Mornings began with roll call and coffee brewed over smoky stoves. Then came inspections. Worth or Herring would check uniforms, weapons, and the readiness of the chambers. Orders were brief, delivered in simple sentences. 3 transports today. Engine maintenance. Increase cremation. These words, spoken in calm voices, determined the deaths of thousands before sunset. After roll call, the guards took positions along the fences or at the arrival platform, waiting for the first train. The moment a transport arrived, the camp came alive. Whistles blew, dogs barked, and the guards snapped into motion. Their movements were practiced, a choreography perfected through repetition. One group opened the doors of the wagons, forcing the people out. Another separated men from women and children. Others directed the flow down the slouch. The deception depended on this precision. Too much brutality, and panic would spread. Too much leniency, and confusion would slow the process. The guards learned when to shout, when to strike, and when to feign calm. The violence became automatic, a series of gestures performed without thought. Among themselves, the SS men referred to the victims not as people, but as pieces or units. It was easier that way. To look into faces was to risk remembering them. They cultivated distance through language, turning empathy into error. When a prisoner's cry broke through the monotony, a guard might lash out, not from anger but from reflex, as if swatting a fly. Violence became language, the only conversation between master and victim. Christian Worth demanded absolute control from his men. He was known for sudden inspections, for appearing without warning and punishing even the smallest breach of order. A dropped rifle, an unclean uniform, a delay in procedure. Each could bring a beating or demotion. The fear of Worth kept discipline tighter than ideology ever could. The men called him Christian the Terrible, but even those who hated him respected his efficiency. He was ruthless in protecting secrecy. When rumors reached him that some guard had spoken to local villagers about the camp, he gathered them in the yard and warned, "One word outside this fence, and you will join those you've sent below the ground." No one doubted he meant it. The hierarchy within the camp mirrored the machinery it commanded. Cold, functional, stripped of sentiment. Orders flowed downward. Silence flowed upward. The guards rarely questioned what they were told. Obedience was easier than thought. They had been trained to follow, not to reflect. In the evenings, after the work was done, the men gathered in the canteen for food, drink, and laughter. Music sometimes played on a gramophone, and for a few hours, the world outside the fences returned. But the stench in the air never let them forget where they were. It clung to their boots, their clothes, their skin. They tried to wash it away with beer and song, but it followed them into sleep. The Ukrainian guards occupied separate quarters, cruder and more crowded. They were treated as tools, not comrades. German SS men gave them orders with contempt, calling them dogs, yet relied on them for every practical act of killing. It was the Ukrainians who herded victims into the chambers, who wielded clubs and bayonets when panic broke out, who loaded bodies onto carts for burial. Some took pleasure in the power. Others carried out their duties with dead eyes. Fear made them brutal, and brutality made them numb. The chain of command left no room for mercy. The daily life of command extended beyond killing. There were reports to write, inventories to track, schedules to confirm. Worth's desk in the command hut was covered in ledgers, train schedules, supply requisitions, bullet counts, fuel consumption records. The paperwork of genocide was meticulous. Every barrel of gasoline for the engines, every roll of barbed wire, every box of ammunition was logged and signed. To the bureaucratic mind, Belzec was an operation of precision. The human cost was invisible in the numbers. On Sundays, the guards rested. Some played cards, others cleaned weapons or walked the perimeter smoking cigarettes. Occasionally, local villagers were brought in to sell food or liquor, turning the death camp into a grotesque marketplace. The men drank heavily, sang German songs, and posed for photographs, smiling faces framed by barbed wire. Those photographs, found decades later, reveal an unsettling truth. Evil rarely looks monstrous in its own time. It looks ordinary, even cheerful, when it believes itself unseen. Inside the system, moral collapse was complete. New recruits learned quickly that questioning orders was dangerous. Once a man crossed the invisible line between witness and participant, there was no going back. The first time he watched a gassing, he might flinch. The second time, he might look away. The third time, he did his job without thought. The transformation was swift and total. Men became instruments, their humanity reprogrammed into efficiency. Some believed they were serving the Reich. Others no longer believed in anything at all. But not all were untouched. There were whispers, small, fleeting acts of decency that went nowhere. A guard who slipped bread to a starving prisoner. Another who turned his head when someone tried to escape. These moments of faint rebellion flickered and died, swallowed by the enormity of the system. To act on conscience was to sign one's own death warrant. The command at Belzec allowed no fractures in its iron routine. Christian Worth's presence loomed over all of it. He was known to say that a perfect operation left no trace, no witnesses, no hesitation, no evidence. That idea became doctrine among his men. Each day they performed their duties with the precision of clockwork, and each night they told themselves it was just another day closer to the war's end. They believed the world beyond the fences would never know what happened here. Yet even within this machinery of control, cracks began to appear. Some guards, haunted by what they saw, asked for transfers. A few were quietly reassigned to other units. Worth allowed it when it served discipline. He preferred men who did not think too much. Others grew reckless, drunk on authority, cruel beyond even the camp's grim norms. They beat prisoners for sport, set dogs on the living, competed to display their dominance. The camp's leadership tolerated it, as long as efficiency remained unaffected. In Belzec, morality was measured in productivity. By late 1942, the command structure ran like an efficient organism. Orders came from Lublin, from the office of Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader for the district. Reports went upward in coded language. Everything was centralized, documented, and filed. Globoknik himself visited the camp occasionally, accompanied by officers from Berlin. They praised the smooth operation. They admired Worth's innovations. They saw nothing human, only success. As the months dragged on, Belzec became a self-contained universe of power and fear. The guards were both masters and prisoners of the system they served. The violence they unleashed was mirrored back upon them in nightmares, in drunken rage, in the hollow quiet of their off-duty hours. Some wrote letters home filled with lies about their service, speaking of guard duty in the East, never mentioning the smoke that hung over the camp or the sound that came from behind sealed walls. The command at Belzec ruled over silence. It was silence that gave them power, the silence of victims deceived, of subordinates too afraid to speak, of the world beyond that did not yet listen. Within that silence, the guards built their own logic, convincing themselves that obedience was virtue and pity was weakness. When a man loses the capacity to name his own horror, he becomes part of it. By the end of the year, when Belzec had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, the hierarchy inside the camp had settled into a kind of dark harmony. The SS officers gave orders. The Ukrainians carried them out. The prisoners died. The chain of command was unbroken, as polished and cold as the bolts on the gas chamber doors. And yet, beneath the veneer of control, the human cost was beginning to show. Men drank more. Tempers snapped. The machinery they operated so efficiently was corroding their minds. Christian Worth could not see it, or refuse to. To him, Belzec was a success, a model for the future. His reports spoke of excellent discipline and commendable results. He could not imagine that the very system he had built would one day bury his name in infamy. The command at Belzec had turned men into tools and obedience into law. Within those fences, morality was not merely suspended, it was inverted. Duty was evil. Silence was virtue. Murder was progress. And though the engines still roared and the trains still came, something irreversible had already begun. The corruption of the soul that no order, no discipline, and no ideology could ever repair. Belzec was a camp of death, but it was also a mirror, reflecting what ordinary men could become when stripped of conscience and given absolute power. The command did not shout its evil. It signed it, stamped it, filed it away. And behind every stamp, every signature, and every salute, a human being disappeared forever into smoke. Chapter 8. Harvesting Lives. The deportations to Belzec. The trains began to move before dawn, sliding out of the sidings with the slow inevitability of fate. Their wheels sang against the rails, metal shrieking like a warning no one would hear. In the towns and ghettos of occupied Poland, the roundups had become part of life's rhythm. Boots pounding on cobblestones, shouts echoing through narrow streets, doors splintering under rifle butts. It began in Lublin, then spread to Zamość, to Tarnow, to the ghettos of Krakow and Lwow. Each place had its own small history, its own families, its own faces. All of them were gathered into the same destiny, funneled into the same monstrous design. Belzec was now ready, its chambers tested, its engines steady, its operators efficient. The system had matured. Now it needed bodies to feed it. The deportations were planned with bureaucratic precision. Orders came from the Reich main security office in Berlin, from the desks of men who never saw the faces of the doomed. They used numbers, quotas, schedules, a language that stripped the humanity from every decision. Lublin district, 50,000. Krakow, 60,000. Galicia, 150,000. The figures were sent to Odilo Globoknik in Lublin, who passed them on to Christian Worth, and the machinery began to turn. The SS called it resettlement, a euphemism so cold it almost seemed absurd. In meeting rooms lit by weak bulbs, officers discussed how many trains could be run per day, how to coordinate with railway authorities, how to prevent panic. Murder was planned in the language of logistics. In the ghettos, life had already been compressed into fear and hunger. People lived in rooms that once held families, but now housed dozens. Disease spread in the winter air. Rumors had begun to trickle in about what resettlement really meant, but they were met with disbelief. Even those who sensed the truth found it impossible to imagine, not because they were naive, but because what was coming was beyond the scope of imagination itself. When the notices went up ordering everyone to assemble at the station, people obeyed. They packed small bags with the essentials of survival: bread, photographs, prayer books, a change of clothes. The deportations were not chaotic at first. They were orchestrated to appear normal. German officers spoke calmly, assuring the crowds that they were being transferred to work camps. Polish policemen and Jewish ghetto officials were often forced to assist. Deception was as vital as brutality. On the day of departure, soldiers formed cordons through the streets. Families marched between them, the sound of feet and sobbing blending with barking dogs. Trains waited on the edge of towns, their black cars lined up like coffins under the sky. People climbed aboard willingly at first, still hoping the journey would lead somewhere survivable. The air inside was thick and fetid. The doors were bolted shut from the outside, sealing in hundreds of souls. As the trains lurched forward, cries filled the darkness. Prayers, songs, screams, the language of disbelief turning into the rhythm of death. Some clawed at the boards for air, some fainted, some fell silent before the train even reached its destination. The journey to Belzec could last hours or days. The cattle cars had no ventilation, no water, no toilets. The heat in summer was unbearable, the cold in winter lethal. Mothers tried to fan children with torn scraps of paper. Men tried to carve air holes with knives or nails, but the wood was too thick. The stench of sweat, urine, and despair filled every inch. When the trains finally stopped at the camp siding, many inside were already dead, suffocated, crushed, or trampled. The guards opened the doors and shouted, "Raus! Schnell!" as if scolding livestock. Bodies tumbled out with the living. The air that greeted the survivors was cold and sharp, but it brought no relief. Ahead of them lay a compound that looked deceptively ordinary, surrounded by pine trees and barbed wire. Belzec was designed for speed. The guards had learned how to handle an entire train in a matter of hours. Each transport carried between 1,000 and 2,000 people. 3 trains a day meant thousands gone by sunset. The victims were separated, stripped, shorn, deceived, and killed within 90 minutes of arrival. From train to grave in less time than it took a family to bake bread. The process was so swift that the staff boasted of its efficiency. Worth kept a logbook in his office, recording the daily totals with the neatness of a bookkeeper balancing accounts. The deportations followed a pattern. Each ghetto emptied in turn. Lublin first, then Krakow, Tarnow, and Lwow. In March 1942, the first major wave began. Whole communities vanished in weeks. The ghetto streets fell silent. The markets emptied. The synagogues left behind like shells of memory. Trains passed through the countryside day and night, their windows sealed, their whistles echoing through villages that pretended not to hear. Polish railway workers sometimes whispered each other, "These trains don't come back." But they kept their heads down. Fear made silence a form of survival. Inside Belzec, the deportations were treated as routine. Guards referred to the transports by number. Transport 17, Transport 22. They did not say the people from Lwow or the children from Tarnow. Names vanished. Even the victims lost track of time. The trains arrived, the doors opened, and the guard shouted. Some of the SS men took pride in how smoothly the system ran. The Ukrainian auxiliaries, hardened by repetition, carried out the violence without thought. They joked, smoked, cursed in several languages, their laughter carrying faintly over the roar of engines. It was a world turned upside down, where killing was duty and silence was mercy. Among the prisoners forced to work in the camp, the deportations were both agony and miracle. They watched the new arrivals with hollow eyes, knowing that each face they saw was doomed. Sometimes they recognized townsfolk, neighbors, even family, but they could say nothing. Their survival depended on obedience. They cleaned the platforms, sorted the clothes, and dragged bodies under the gaze of men who could end their lives with a gesture. Every new transport meant more corpses to burn, more ash to scatter, more ghosts to carry in silence. There were brief moments when resistance flared, desperate and doomed. In one transport from Zamosk, a group of young men tried to fight as they were driven toward the chambers. They were shot instantly, their bodies left in the sand as warning. In another, a woman screamed the word murderers before being struck down. Her cry echoed through the camp, haunting even the guards who had long stopped listening. But no act of defiance could alter the machinery of death. The trains kept coming. By mid-1942, the numbers had become incomprehensible. The SS tallied over 150,000 killed at Belzec by summer's end. Yet the work continued, relentless and unseen. The outside world still did not know. The deportations were disguised as resettlement convoys, their routes hidden in the labyrinth of wartime logistics. Railway timetables listed them among ordinary freight. Station masters signed papers without reading them. German soldiers guarding the lines joked that their cargo did not complain. The banality of it was the final horror, the quiet cooperation of thousands who chose not to see. The geography of the transports mirrored the geography of extermination. From Krakow, trains rolled through Tarnow and Rzeszów before reaching Belzec. From Lwow, they followed the line south through the forests of Galicia. Every station along the way became a witness, every crossing a silent accomplice. Children pressed faces to the cracks in the boards, catching glimpses of trees, rivers, towns, fragments of a world that was already leaving them behind. Some threw notes through the slats, scraps of paper that fluttered into fields and ditches. Farmers found them days later, messages written in pencil. "We are being taken to Belzec. Pray for us." Most of those papers never reached their destinations. The deportations were not only a Polish tragedy. Jews from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia were also sent east, believing they were being resettled for labor. Their trains took longer, sometimes stopping for days at junctions. By the time they reached Belzec, many passengers were already corpses. The guard dragged them out and piled them like firewood. Those who could still stand were processed with the same indifference as all the rest. To the SS, nationality made no difference. In Belzec, there were no Germans, no Poles, no Austrians, only arrivals. Inside the camp, the sound of trains became the soundtrack of existence. The screech of brakes, the clang of doors, the barking of orders. When the last transport of the day departed empty, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. The Ukrainian guards played cards by lantern light. The SS officers filed reports. The prisoners cleaned the tracks, sweeping away blood and scraps of clothing. By dawn, the station would look untouched, ready for the next convoy. It was the perfection of erasure. Each deportation fed not just death, but an economy of plunder. Trains carried away not only human ashes, but material spoils. Gold teeth melted into bars, jewelry sorted by value, suitcases packed with watches, spectacles, shoes, and hair. The shipments went to Lublin, then to the Reich. Bureaucrats tallied them as recovered goods. Even in annihilation, efficiency ruled. The victims' last possessions became part of the machinery that funded their killers. There were moments when the scale of what they were doing seemed to dawn even on the perpetrators. Hackenholt, the mechanic who ran the gas engines, once complained to Wirth about the stench and exhaustion, saying, "We can't go on like this." Wirth stared at him coldly and replied, "You'll go on until it's finished." And so they did. They kept the engines running, the fires burning, the trains arriving. Every man inside the camp was trapped in the same current, swept along by the momentum of the crime. In the ghettos that still remained, emptiness grew. Streets that once hummed with children's laughter fell silent. The sound of prayer and music vanished. Some towns were left with only a handful of Jews hidden in attics or cellars. The deportations had stripped the heart out of Jewish life in Poland. The survivors, not yet knowing what had happened to their families, still waited for letters that would never come. Rumors of Belzec began to spread, whispers of a place where no one returned, where smoke rose constantly from the trees. But the rumors were too vague, too monstrous to be believed. The world was not ready for the truth. By autumn of 1942, Belzec had become a name spoken only in fear. The deportations had slowed, not because the killing was over, but because there were fewer people left to deport. The ghettos of Lublin, Krakow, and Galicia had been emptied. The machinery had done its work too well. Still, trains arrived sporadically, carrying the remnants of destroyed communities, the last of a people being erased in silence. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the rhythm faltered. The autumn rains came, turning the camp soil into mud. The pit swelled, the smoke hung low. The SS officers began to talk of new methods, of final cleanup. They had harvested lives on a scale that defied comprehension, and now they faced the problem of concealment. The same trains that had brought millions to their deaths would soon carry the stolen goods and ashes away, as if the victims themselves could be removed from history. But the truth clung to the rails. The iron remembered the weight. The ground remembered the ash. The air itself seemed to hum with what had happened. The deportations to Belzec were not just a movement of people. They were the transportation of civilization into oblivion, carried on tracks built for commerce, timetabled for murder, disguised as order. As winter approached, the last trains arrived under gray skies. The guards still shouted. The engines still roared. But the work was almost done. The fields of Galicia were empty, the ghettos dissolved, the warehouses full of stolen property. Belzec had devoured entire cities and still hungered. Yet even its hunger was finite. The SS were already planning to dismantle it, to erase the traces, to build over the graves. But no amount of erasure could undo what the rails had carried, or the silence they left behind. The deportations had ended, but the sound of those trains would never fade. It would echo across decades, in testimony, in nightmares, in the uneasy sleep of the world that had stood and watched the smoke rise from the east. Belzec had done its work, swiftly, efficiently, invisibly. The harvest of lives was complete, but the ground beneath still whispered the truth, waiting for someone, someday, to listen. Chapter 9. Counting the Dead. Evidence and the Hopeful Telegram. When the killing finally slowed, there was no ceremony, no declaration of completion. The last trains came quietly, as if even the railway wanted to forget where they had been. The guards moved with exhaustion, the SS officers with mechanical detachment. Smoke still lingered over the camp, faint and oily, drifting between the trees. The ground trembled where the pits swelled beneath the soil. But outside the barbed wire, there was no sound at all. The birds avoided the place. The villagers walked in wider circles. Only the wind seemed to remember the names that had been erased. Inside the offices of the SS and police in Lublin, the work continued. Reports, statistics, memos. For the men who had designed Operation Reinhard, success was not measured in morality or conscience, but in numbers. Death had become arithmetic. Christian Worth's staff recorded everything, not for the sake of truth, but for control. Every train that arrived at Belzec was logged. Every transport that left the ghettos had a manifest. Every kilogram of hair, every shipment of shoes, every gold filling extracted from corpses was accounted for in ledgers stamped with official seals. Bureaucracy demanded it. Murder was not chaos here. It was structure, balance, calculation. The clerks at the desks in Lublin filled forms with tidy handwriting, noting special treatment, processing complete, transport returned. Their ink was the color of blood diluted through distance. But numbers had a way of escaping their masters. Among the documents that survived the collapse of the Reich was a simple radio telegram, routine, coded, and chillingly concise. It was sent on January 11th, 1943, by Hermann Höfel, the deputy commander of Operation Reinhard, from Lublin to SS headquarters in Berlin. The message was a summary, a progress report. It contained 4 lines, one for each of the death camps under Operation Reinhard: Lublin, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belzec. Next to Belzec, Höfel wrote a figure, 434,508. That number was not an estimate. It was an accounting of how many Jews had been murdered there between March and December of 1942. The telegram was intercepted by British codebreakers in Bletchley Park, filed away, and forgotten among the thousands of routine German communications. Only decades later would historians uncover its meaning. The war's most precise confession of genocide had been hiding in plain sight. At the time, the message meant nothing to its authors beyond efficiency. To Höfel, to Globoknik, to Worth, the number represented completion, a logistical achievement. 434,000 souls reduced to one neat figure, transmitted through military channels like an inventory. They called it progress. They did not need to write the word killed. It was understood. Everyone in that network spoke the same coded language, where euphemism replaced morality and the act of annihilation became administration. Processed, handled, resettled, special treatment. The words were walls behind which the screams could not be heard. Belzec itself left almost no witnesses. Of the hundreds of thousands who entered, only 2 would survive to tell the story: Rudolf Ritter and Chaim Hersman. Their testimonies, recorded years later, fill the void that numbers cannot. Ritter was a metalworker from Lwów, deported to Belzec in late 1942. He was selected by chance to work in the camp's workshops, repairing engines and machinery. He lived through months of death before escaping during a transport to Lublin. His account describes the rhythm of the killings with terrifying detail: the trains arriving, the cries, the smoke. He remembered the faces of the guards, the smell of burning flesh that never left his clothes. It was not a camp, he said. It was a factory of corpses. Hersman, another survivor, escaped in 1943 and later testified before Polish investigators. He too spoke of the daily exterminations, the deceptions, the silence afterward. But before he could give a full account, he was murdered by post-war anti-Semitic partisans. His voice, like so many others, was silenced again. For decades, Belzec existed in memory only as a rumor, a whisper among survivors of the ghettos. Unlike Auschwitz, there were no barracks left, no visible ruins, no mountains of shoes or hair. The Germans had done their work thoroughly. When Operation Reinhard was shut down at the end of 1942, Wirth ordered the camp dismantled. Buildings were torn down, the gas chambers demolished, the graves exhumed. Prisoners from nearby camps were brought in under a special operation known as Sonderaction 1005, the code name for the cover-up of mass graves across Eastern Europe. They dug up the decomposing bodies, crushed bones, and burned the remains on huge pyres made from railway tracks and logs. Ash was scattered, pits refilled, the soil plowed and planted with lupins and rye. A farmhouse was built on the site, with a Ukrainian family installed as caretakers, to give the illusion of rural peace. The earth was meant to forget, but earth remembers. Still, even the best-engineered silence has seams. In the post-war years, traces began to emerge, in testimonies, in documents, in rumors collected by investigators. The Polish Central Commission for the Investigation of German Crimes documented the site in the late 1940s, describing depressions in the ground, charred bones, fragments of human remains brought to the surface by rain. Farmers in the area spoke of ashes rising like dust in the wind. They remembered the strange texture of the soil, how it refused to grow crops, how the smell lingered after rain. In one place, children had found a skull while playing. In another, a piece of metal with a Star of David engraved. The Germans had tried to erase Belzec from existence, but the land itself refused to comply. The question that haunted historians was not only how many died, but how such a place could leave so little behind. Auschwitz had witnesses, photographs, and survivors by the thousands. Treblinka had its uprising. Belzec had only numbers. The 434,508 from the hopeful telegram became the camp's ghost, the only voice it had left. For years, that number was debated, recalculated, cross-referenced with deportation lists and testimonies. Some estimates rose to 500,000, others fell slightly below. But the exact count is less important than the truth it represents, that in less than 10 months, more than 400,000 human beings were murdered in a place designed to vanish. The British codebreakers who intercepted Hofel's telegram never knew what they had read. To them, it was another routine message from an enemy logistics officer. The line, 434508 Jews, was indecipherable outside the context of genocide. It sat in a file for years, stamped top secret, gathering dust until historians in the 1980s rediscovered it in the Public Record Office in London. Only then did the world understand that the Nazis had documented their own crime in the language of progress reports. The telegram remains one of the most chilling artifacts of the Holocaust, a confession without remorse, a statement of industrialized death transmitted over radio waves. Meanwhile, the few who survived or lived near Belzec carried the memory differently. Some could never speak of it. Others spoke endlessly, afraid silence would make them complicit. In Poland, survivors of the ghettos that had fed Belzec began to gather in the 1950s, erecting small monuments in towns where Jewish life had been erased. On the site of the camp itself, a crude wooden cross stood for years, not because the victims were Christian, but because it was all the locals could manage in a time of censorship and neglect. The official memorial would not come until decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the world finally began to understand the scale of what had happened in that quiet corner of Galicia. The counting of the dead is an act both impossible and necessary. Each number conceals a name, and each name conceals a world. In Lwo, there had been synagogues filled with music, schools, shops, laughter in the streets. In Tarnow, children ran through markets while their parents bartered for fruit. In Krakow, weddings filled the courtyards of Kazimierz with song. All of it was erased, replaced by one figure on a radio message, 434,508. How does one measure that? How does one imagine the sound of that many voices extinguished? The number is too vast for the mind and too small for the truth. Even among the perpetrators, some fragments of conscience surfaced after the war. Joseph Oberhauser, Wirth's deputy, was captured and tried in Germany in the 1960s. He admitted his role at Belzec, but claimed he had only followed orders. The court sentenced him to 4.5 years in prison, less time than it had taken to kill the victims he supervised. Others escaped justice altogether. Wirth himself was killed by partisans in 1944. Hackenholt disappeared, never found. The Ukrainians melted back into the chaos of war, their names lost in the wreckage of Europe. No one paid for Belzec. No one truly could. When Polish archaeologists returned to the site in the late 1990s, they found the ground still breathing. Beneath a thin layer of soil lay enormous pits filled with human ash, bone fragments, melted glass, charred wood. The air was heavy, the silence thick. The investigators avoided disturbing the graves. They mapped them instead with ground-penetrating radar. They counted at least 33 mass burial sites within the camp's perimeter. No bodies, no coffins, no markers. Just layers of burned and crushed humanity compressed into the earth. The figures from the hopeful telegram were no longer abstract. They had weight, they had smell, they had presence. The attempt to count the dead is more than a historical task. It is an act of defiance against erasure. Every document, every testimony, every shovel of dirt turned at Belzec is an answer to the men who tried to make it disappear. The Nazis believed that by destroying the evidence, they could destroy memory itself. But memory does not die so easily. It clings to the smallest things. A piece of jewelry found in the soil, a page of a prayer book carried by the wind, a line of code and a forgotten message. The dead at Belzec were meant to vanish. Instead, they became numbers so precise, so bureaucratic, that they condemned their killers in their own language. Standing on that ground today, one can still feel the tremor of the past beneath the grass. The wind moves differently there, heavy with a presence that has no voice but refuses to be silent. The pine trees that once hid the camp now mark its boundaries. The air carries a faint sweetness, not of flowers, but of soil that has been fed with ash. The number from the telegram, 434,508, hangs in the air like a breath that never ends. Each digit is a life, each space between them a silence that cannot be filled. Belzec was not the largest of the death camps, nor the most famous, but in its precision, its invisibility, and its near-total silence, it stands as the purest embodiment of the Holocaust machinery, a place where death was reduced to data, where murder was performed with bureaucratic detachment, where the line between paper and grave blurred until they were one and the same. The hopeful telegram is the mirror of that world, a single page that contains the essence of industrialized annihilation, stripped of emotion, devoid of language, yet louder than any scream. The men who sent it are gone. The camp they built is gone. But the number remains, carved not on stone, but in history itself. A number that carries the weight of absence, a reminder that behind every statistic is a face, behind every record is a voice that once sang, laughed, dreamed. The counting of the dead at Belzec is not finished. It never will be. Each generation must count again, not to reach an exact figure, but to understand that in the arithmetic of atrocity, every single life destroyed was a world entire. And somewhere, still, the ghosts of those who vanished into smoke seem to whisper through the trees, not to accuse, but to remind. To remind that the silence after the train stopped is not the end of the story, but its echo. To remind that even a single telegram can hold the weight of 400,000 souls. And to remind that though the killers try to count their victims to erase them, the act of counting itself would ensure that they would never be forgotten. Chapter 10. Erasing Belzec. The orders came down quietly, delivered not with urgency, but with the cold precision that had always defined Operation Reinhard. Belzec had done its work. The ghettos of Galicia, Krakow, and Lublin were emptied, their populations swallowed by smoke and silence. The numbers were tidy, the reports complete, the system perfected. Now came the final phase, concealment. For the men who had built the camp, this was not a moral reckoning. It was a logistical problem. How to erase a place that had devoured nearly 500,000 souls? How to make the earth itself forget? The plan to dismantle Belzec was as meticulous as the plan that had built it. The same minds that had designed chambers and pits now drafted blueprints for erasure. The operation would take months. The goal was simple: leave nothing behind. The first step was to kill the remaining prisoners. Those few who had survived months of forced labor, sorting belongings, burning bodies, cleaning the grounds, were now liabilities. They knew too much. The SS gathered them one morning, telling them they were being transferred to another camp. They were led to the woods beyond the wire, to the edge of a shallow trench. The guards fired quickly, efficiently. The bodies fell into the pit they had dug themselves. The sound of the earth falling over them was the sound of the last witnesses being buried alive. After that, Belzec belonged only to the dead. Then came the machinery. Ukrainian auxiliaries and new labor detachments were brought from nearby camps. Their orders were clear: dismantle everything. The wooden watchtowers came down first, their timbers stacked and burned. The barracks were stripped of planks and nails. The fences were torn out, their posts dragged into piles. Even the gas chambers, those brick monuments to precision, were demolished piece by piece, their foundations dug up and scattered. Nothing could remain that might betray the camp's design. The bricks were crushed and used to pave nearby roads. The steel fittings were carted off to Lublin. Within weeks, the physical skeleton of Belzec was gone. But the true horror was below. The mass graves, vast, shifting wounds in the soil, could not simply be buried. The ground was unstable, bubbling with gases from the decomposition of hundreds of thousands. After rain, the earth moved, releasing odors that carried for miles. It was this stench that had driven Worth to the next phase, the cremation of the dead. The work was entrusted to a Sonderkommando of Jewish prisoners transferred from Sobibor. They arrived under heavy guard, unaware of their task until they were led to the pits. What they saw defied reason: layers upon layers of bodies compressed by time and weight, twisted together in grotesque embrace, skin slipping from bone. The air was thick with decay, a sickly sweetness that clung to their lungs. The cremation began with experiments. Hackenholt, ever the engineer, devised a system using railway tracks as grates, laid across concrete blocks. Bodies were stacked in alternating layers with wood, doused in gasoline, and set alight. The flames roared, fed by the fat of the dead. The smoke turned the sky black for miles. The fires burned for days, the heat so intense it warped the metal rails. The men tending the pyres worked until their skin blistered, their faces gray with ash. They shoveled bones, crushed skulls, scattered remains. The cycle never ended. Burn, crush, scatter, repeat. The cremations went on through the summer and into the fall of 1943. Christian Worth oversaw it all with the same detachment he had shown during the killings. To him, this was another phase of the operation, the final one. He spoke of sanitation, land reclamation, hygienic necessity. The language of bureaucracy once again wrapped murder in civility. He even issued reports to Lublin describing the progress of the cleansing. The numbers were different now. Not how many were killed, but how many tons of ash had been processed, how many cubic meters of graves refilled. Belzec was being reduced to measurements, its dead translated into volume and weight. When the pyres cooled, the ashes were mixed with sand and soil to disguise them. The pits were leveled, and wildflowers planted over the ground. Pine saplings were brought in from nearby forests, their roots drinking from the poisoned earth. The SS ordered the remaining ashes spread across the fields so that no single site could be identified. Even the paths and drainage ditches were filled and plowed. In the end, what had once been a machine of death was now a quiet clearing, a patch of cultivated land with a small farmhouse at its center. That farmhouse became the final layer of the lie. It was built on the site of the gas chambers, a modest building with whitewashed walls and a thatched roof. A Ukrainian farmer and his family were moved in, given livestock and tools. Their presence was meant to disguise everything: the smoke, the strange texture of the soil, the bones that surfaced after rain. They were told not to ask questions. Occasionally, visitors from the SS came to inspect the site, posing as agricultural officers. They walked the fields, nodded in approval, and left satisfied that the erasure was complete. From the road, Belzec looked like nothing more than a small farm in the hills of eastern Poland. But even erased places leave shadows. The villagers nearby noticed things that did not fit. They spoke of the ground being too warm in winter, of a faint odor that rose after the rain, of dogs that dug in the soil and came back with bones. Children found bits of glass, fragments of jewelry, teeth that glimmered like ivory in the dirt. The farmer's wife refused to draw water from the well nearest the old camp. She said it tasted of ash. The forest around the site grew differently too, darker, denser, as if the trees themselves were feeding on something unnatural. The silence, there was not peace. It was memory. The SS had succeeded in erasing Belzec from maps and reports. After 1943, it ceased to appear in correspondence. Berlin's archives held no plans, no construction orders. The word Belzec was used only as a reference point for logistics, materials transferred from Belzec, personnel reassigned from Belzec. It was as if the place had never existed. The men who had worked there were dispersed to other camps. Worth and his staff went on to oversee Sobibor and Treblinka, applying what they had learned. The Ukrainian guards were sent to fight partisans. Some were later captured and executed. Others vanished into the fog of war. Belzec was over. Its silence was its success. And yet, even the most carefully planned silence cannot last forever. After the war, as the Red Army swept across Poland, they found nothing but a farmhouse and a field. The Soviets passed through without understanding what lay beneath their boots. It was not until the late 1940s that Polish investigators, guided by survivor testimony, began to dig. They found bones within inches of the surface, shards of bone that cracked beneath their spades. The soil was mixed with gray ash. The air smelled faintly of burning, even after years of rain. They realized then that they were standing on the remains of hundreds of thousands. The erasure had failed, not in execution, but in permanence. The earth had remembered what men had tried to make it forget. For the Germans who had built and destroyed Belzec, the moral reckoning never truly came. Most went back to ordinary lives. Some died in battle. Others lived quietly, never speaking of what they had done. The system that had demanded their obedience no longer existed, but its language lingered, in the way they described their past, in the words they avoided. When interrogated, they spoke in euphemisms even decades later: special duties, security operations, anti-partisan work. They still could not say the word murder. To them, Belzec remained an administrative episode, not a moral abyss. But for the survivors of the surrounding towns, for the few who escaped deportation or hid in forests, Belzec became a wound that never closed. They returned after the war to find their homes empty, their synagogues destroyed, their families gone. They walked to the edge of the camp and found nothing but grass and trees. Some wept, others knelt in silence. The absence was unbearable because it was complete. They could not even bury their dead, because the ground itself was the grave. For them, memory was the only form of resistance left. Over time, the traces of Belzec became part of the landscape's folklore. Villagers warned children not to play near the forest, saying it was haunted. At night, people claimed to hear whispers when the wind blew across the fields. Old farmers spoke of seeing strange lights hovering over the soil, the souls, they said, of those who had been denied proper burial. The legends were not superstition. They were an attempt to give voice to the silence, to explain the unexplainable. The dead had been erased from records, but they lingered in the air, in the ground, in memory. In the 1960s, when the first post-war trials began in Germany, Belzec re-entered history. Survivors like Rudolf Redder testified, their words the only remaining evidence of the camp's operation. Redder described the chambers, the engines, the fires, the smell of death that never faded from his skin. He spoke softly, methodically, as if afraid that emotion might make the truth less believable. The judges listened, the audience wept, but the sentences were short, the guilt diluted by time. Wirth was long dead, killed by partisans in Yugoslavia. Hackenholt was never found. Oberhauser, tried in Munich, served a few years and lived quietly afterward. Belzec had been designed to leave no witnesses, and even in justice it remained mostly invisible. By the end of the 20th century, the field where the camp once stood had changed again. Grass covered the soil, pine trees grew tall, and only faint depressions in the ground hinted at the graves below. For decades, local residents treated it as ordinary land, unaware or unwilling to know what lay beneath. In 2004, a new memorial was finally completed. The site was enclosed in a ring of black stone, the ground left untouched to preserve the mass graves. A narrow path winds through a landscape of cracked concrete slabs, resembling the fissures of broken earth. At the center stands a single opening, the symbolic gate through which the victims entered. There are no names, no individual markers. Only one inscription: Earth, do not cover their blood. The memorial is silent, but it breathes. Standing there, one can feel the weight of what is buried, the compression of a million moments of terror into the stillness of a single place. The wind hums softly through the stones. The sky above is wide and indifferent. No birds sing inside the perimeter. It is as if even nature still holds its breath. The erasure that Wirth and his men began has been undone not by vengeance, but by remembrance. The soil that was meant to hide the crime has become its witness. And yet, the act of erasure itself remains part of the story. The destruction of Belzec was not just an attempt to hide evidence. It was the logical conclusion of a system built on the idea that life could be made disposable, that reality itself could be manipulated until nothing human remained. The same rationality that built the chambers also dictated their demolition. It was efficiency carried to its final, nihilistic extreme. In trying to erase Belzec, the perpetrators revealed their ultimate fear, that the truth, even buried, would one day rise again. Today, the name Belzec stands as both a void and a warning. It is a place that no longer exists, yet refuses to disappear. It is a symbol of how easily horror can vanish from view when hidden behind euphemisms and paperwork. But it is also proof that nothing human can ever be entirely erased. The earth remembers. The air remembers. History, however delayed, remembers. And so, beneath the grass and the wildflowers, beneath the black stones and the quiet sky, the story of Belzec endures, not in monuments or speeches, but in the unbroken silence that demands to be listened to. The silence left by 500,000 souls whose names were never written, whose deaths were never recorded, whose ashes became the very ground beneath our feet. The men who tried to erase them are gone. Their empire of lies has crumbled to dust. But the memory they feared most, the truth, still burns quietly, indestructible, within the soil they once believed they could cleanse. The erasure of Belzec failed, not because the killers lacked skill, but because memory cannot be engineered out of existence. It seeps through cracks, rises through time, and waits for the living to remember. And so, in the end, the camp that was meant to disappear stands eternal in its absence, a scar on the world's conscience, a place where the earth itself refuses to forget. Chapter 11. The Silence After. When the last ember of Belzec's fires faded, the silence that followed was unlike any other. It was not peace. It was not the calm of a world healing. It was the kind of silence that feels like an echo, as if the air itself remembers what it once carried. The camp was gone, its chambers dismantled, its graves leveled, its victims reduced to ash that mingled with the soil. But silence is never empty. Beneath it, memory moves, slow, invisible, relentless. And so, even as the SS congratulated themselves for erasing all trace of their work, the silence they left behind began its long, patient work of remembering. In the months after the dismantling, the area around Belzec looked deceptively normal. The farmhouse stood quietly at the edge of the clearing, smoke curling from its chimney. Chickens scratched the dirt. The Ukrainian family who had been moved there tended their fields, planting rye potatoes in the same soil that hid hundreds of thousands. The German soldiers were gone. The trains had stopped. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the woods were still. Yet, the ground was restless. After rain, gray water bubbled from the pits. The soil sank in patches where gases still rose from the decomposing bodies below. The farmer's plow would catch on something solid, a bone, a shoe, a button, and he would stop, glance around, and cover it again. He had been told not to speak, not to ask. The land had been declared cleansed. But nothing that holds so much death can ever truly be clean. In the nearby village, people whispered. The villagers had always known something unspeakable had happened up there in the forest. They remembered the trains, the smoke, the screams that the wind carried on certain nights. They had seen the guards in their black uniforms, the dogs, the wagons loaded with clothing. But now, with the camp gone, they faced a different kind of fear, the fear of truth. Some chose to forget. Others couldn't. They avoided the road that led to the site, claiming the air made them sick. Children were told stories of ghosts and curses, warnings disguised as folklore. Don't go near the forest, mothers said. The ground there eats people. As the war dragged on and the front lines shifted east, Belzec slipped into obscurity. The Red Army marched through in 1944, driving the Germans back, but they did not stop. To them, it was just another field in a ravaged land. There were too many such places, too many ruins. They had seen cities in ashes, villages wiped from maps, rivers choked with bodies. Belzec was just one more scar among millions. The Soviets took photographs, recorded a few details, and moved on. The farmhouse still stood. The Ukrainian family stayed. The silence deepened. When peace finally came, it was a peace made of rubble. Poland was shattered. The survivors who crawled out of forests, cellars, and hiding places began their long search for the living. They walked through towns that no longer existed, through neighborhoods stripped of identity. In Krakow, Tarnow, Lwow, all across the east, people asked the same question. Where did they go? The answer came in fragments, in whispers, in the words of those who had seen the trains. They were sent east, some said, to a camp near Lublin, to Belzec. The name passed from mouth to mouth like a secret too heavy to carry. There were no records, no letters, no survivors to confirm it. But everyone who heard the word felt the weight of it. Belzec became not a place, but an absence, a black hole into which entire families had vanished. In the first years after the war, investigators from the Polish Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes visited the site. They expected ruins, structures, evidence. What they found was grass and quiet. The farmhouse remained, the fields were plowed, the trees young and straight. But the earth beneath their boots was soft, sinking. In places, the soil was gray, oily, and smelled faintly of char. When they dug shallow pits, fragments appeared. Bones, bits of clothing, shards of glass, teeth. One investigator later wrote, "The ground here is not earth. It is ash." They marked the area, recorded their findings, and left, unsure what to do with a place that was both graveyard and field. The few survivors who returned to testify spoke with the clarity of those who had carried their memories in silence for years. Rudolf Retter, who had escaped from Belzec, told his story to anyone who would listen. He described the deception, the chambers, the smell of burning flesh, the guards' laughter, the endless smoke. He said the worst part was not the killing itself, but the knowledge that no one outside would believe it. He was right. For decades, Belzec was overshadowed by the larger, more infamous camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek. The world knew their names. Belzec remained a whisper, a place erased so effectively that even Remembrance struggled to find its way there. In the early years of the People's Republic of Poland, the official narrative of the war focused on heroism and resistance, not on extermination. The site of Belzec was neglected, overgrown. Locals grazed cattle there. Children played among the trees. The farmhouse eventually decayed and collapsed, its white walls stained gray by weather and time. What had been the epicenter of industrial killing became a forgotten clearing. Occasionally, people digging foundations for new buildings found human remains. They reported them to the authorities. The reports were filed and ignored. The silence persisted, not from malice, but from the exhaustion of a nation that had too many dead to mourn. But memory is patient. It waits in the dark. In the 1960s, when Germany began to put its war criminals on trial, Belzec re-emerged from the shadows. Journalists and historians began asking questions. Where was the camp? Who had commanded it? What had happened there? Files long buried in archives were reopened. The name Belzec appeared again, first in legal documents, then in newspapers. Survivors were sought out. One by one, the fragments began to reconnect. In 1963, the trial of Joseph Oberhauser, the camp's deputy commander, took place in Munich. It was the only trial ever held for Belzec. The courtroom was filled with the smell of old wood and cigarette smoke. The prosecutors spoke in careful tones, listing names and dates, quoting reports written in the language of bureaucracy. Oberhauser sat quietly, a balding man in glasses, his expression unreadable. When asked about his role, he said he had been just a soldier following orders. He spoke of special operations, assignments, duty. He did not say murder. The witnesses spoke differently. Their voices trembled, but did not break. They described the screams, the fire, the faces of the dead. They spoke of the trains, of the deception, of the smell that still haunted their dreams. When it was over, the court sentenced Oberhauser to 4.5 years in prison. He served less than half. Justice, like the camp itself, was almost invisible. But the trial had one unintended consequence. It broke the silence. Newspapers printed the name Belzec in headlines. Scholars began to dig deeper. Survivors wrote memoirs. The forgotten camp began to take shape again in the collective consciousness. It was no longer a rumor. It was a place. It had coordinates, witnesses, and a name that refused to fade. Yet, even as its history was resurrected, the site itself remained neglected. Grass grew tall over the graves. The wind blew unchecked. People still walked across it without knowing what lay beneath their feet. By the late 20th century, historians had pieced together the scope of the crime. Using deportation records, German transport lists, and the hopeful telegram, the intercepted radio message that listed 434,508 victims. They reconstructed the magnitude of Belzec's destruction. But numbers, though necessary, are cold. They cannot capture the sound of children crying as they were herded into chambers, or the sight of smoke rising above pine trees. The historian's pen can record, but it cannot resurrect. The silence after Belzec remained vast. In 1997, Polish and Israeli archaeologists began a new investigation at the site. This time, they used careful methods to avoid disturbing the graves. With radar, soil sampling, and aerial mapping, they traced the outlines of the camp. They found the remnants of foundations, the depressions of mass graves, and countless small fragments of human remains. Each discovery was treated with reverence. The archaeologists spoke of the ground as if it were alive, breathing, remembering, mourning. They uncovered the truth the SS had tried so hard to bury, that even erasure leaves traces. The findings led to a new memorial. Completed in 2004, it transformed the site into a landscape of memory. The mass graves were covered with a thick layer of crushed basalt, forming a dark, cracked surface that resembles a wound sealed over time. A narrow path cuts through it, leading to a single opening in the stone, a symbolic gate of death. The names of destroyed communities are carved into the walls. There are no statues, no grand gestures, only silence, the same silence that has always lived there, now given shape and purpose. Standing at that memorial, one feels time collapse. The wind that moves through the cracks carries the same chill that once filled the chambers. The trees that grow beyond the wall sway like witnesses that cannot speak. The stones absorb sound. Even footsteps seem muffled. The visitor walks not through history, but through absence. The absence of 500,000 voices, the absence of a world that once was. There is no comfort there, only understanding. The silence after Belzec is not emptiness. It is presence too immense for words. And yet, that silence is also defiance. The Nazis tried to erase Belzec to make their crime untraceable, but silence is turned against them. Every quiet moment on that ground is now a monument to what they could not destroy. The persistence of truth. The air remembers. The earth remembers. Every gust of wind that crosses those fields carries fragments of ash and memory. Every generation that walks there breathes in what was meant to be forgotten. Today, the story of Belzec is taught in museums, written in books, whispered in prayers. Its name no longer hides in the footnotes of history. It stands beside Auschwitz and Treblinka as one of the great symbols of the Holocaust machinery, not because of its size, but because of its silence. It teaches that evil does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it organizes, sometimes it files reports and stamps papers. And sometimes, when the work is done, it tries to disappear. But it cannot. The silence after Belzec stretches across time. It reaches into our present, asking questions that no number or monument can answer. How could a place so ordinary become the center of such horror? How did the world allow so many to vanish without trace? And what does it mean to remember a place built to erase memory itself? There are no full answers, only the responsibility to keep asking. In the stillness of that place, history is not over. It breathes beneath the surface, waiting for those who come to listen. And if one stands long enough, with the wind pressing against their skin and the weight of the world pressing against their heart, they might hear it, faintly, impossibly, the sound beneath the silence. Not words, not cries, but the murmuring of a truth that will not die. Because Belzec, though erased, is not gone. It lives in the silence it left behind, a silence that accuses, mourns, and remembers. A silence that outlasted the men who built it, the empire that ordered it, and the decades that tried to forget it. The silence after Belzec is not absence. It is eternity, echoing softly through the soil that once swallowed the fire. Chapter 12. What the Earth Remembers. When you stand on the soil where Belzec once stood, there is no sound, no engines, no screams, no marching boots. Only the wind through the pine trees, whispering over the black gravel paths and cracked stone slabs that now cover the ground. Yet beneath that silence, Beneath the grass and the roots, the earth remembers. It remembers the weight of the trains, the thunder of iron wheels carrying thousands toward their end. It remembers the heat of the fires that burned for months, the smoke that turned the sky gray, the bones that fell to ash. It remembers the hands that dug and the feet that stumbled and the last breaths that never found air. The world above has moved on, but the ground beneath still carries the echo of everything that was done here. Time has changed the surface, but not the truth. Decades have passed since the final fire went out, and still the soil exhales traces of the dead. Rainwater rises through layers of ash, turning gray before seeping back down. In winter, frost outlines the shallow depressions where graves once swelled. In summer, the heat releases a faint metallic odor that no one can explain. Visitors come, walking slowly, heads bowed, speaking in whispers as if afraid to wake something ancient. The memorial stones absorb the light, black and heavy, as if they too carry the weight of memory. The world around them hums with life. Cars on distant roads, birds in the trees. But here, every sound seems hesitant, subdued by the gravity of what lies below. The earth remembers the rhythm of the trains first, each arrival marked by the same sequence. The whistle cutting through the air, the brakes screeching, the rumble fading into a stillness heavy with fear. The ground trembled each time, and the vibrations sank deep into the clay and sand. Scientists say that soil records vibration, that layers compact differently under repeated pressure. If that is true, then Belzec's ground is not just a grave, but a chronicle. It's straight up patterned by the tremors of arrival and death. Every shudder of a wheel, every boot step, every muffled cry is written there, invisible but eternal. The ground remembers, too, the weight of human bodies, not as individuals, not as names, but as an immense, unbearable mass. Hundreds of thousands pressed into the same soil, layer upon layer, until the earth itself could no longer hold them. The Germans try to erase it, to burn every trace, to scatter the ashes so finely that no one could ever count them. But ash does not vanish. It fuses with the ground. It alters the chemistry of life itself. The plants that grow here grow differently, darker, thicker, their roots twisting around fragments of bone and glass. When archaeologists took samples decades later, they found traces of calcium and phosphorus far beyond natural levels. The ground had digested humanity, and even now, it refuses to forget the taste. The earth remembers the sound of engines, the heavy thrum of Soviet tank motors repurposed for murder, the metallic chug of exhaust forced through pipes into sealed rooms. Those engines ran for hours each day, their heat radiating through the camp, their rhythm marking time in place of clocks. Even the birds stopped singing while the engines ran. The smoke drifted east, mixing with the morning mist. Sometimes it was black, sometimes blue-gray, sometimes almost invisible, but the smell never changed, a thick, oily scent that clung to uniforms, hair, and trees. The guards carried that smell with them long after they left Belzec. The villagers said they could recognize them by it. Years later, long after the camp was gone, the smell would rise again during rainstorms, faint but unmistakable, as if the air itself still carried the memory of combustion. The ground remembers those who try to survive within its boundaries, the prisoners forced to build, to dig, to clean, to burn. Their footsteps carved faint paths between the gas chambers, the pits, the barracks. They spoke in whispers, shared scraps of bread, counted days in the dark. They worked under whips, their eyes hollowed by terror and exhaustion. The ground beneath them was already soft, already shifting from the weight of the dead below. Some buried messages in bottles, scraps of paper, cloth. A few tried to run, vanishing into the forest, most caught before they reached the river. The ground knows where they fell. Their blood seeped into its pores, and even now, in certain places, the grass grows thinner, the color slightly different. It is as though the soil itself grieves. The earth remembers the voices, not all at once, but as fragments, cries of confusion, prayers in Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, German, the voices of mothers calling children, the silence that followed. Sound leaves no fossils, no artifacts, but it lingers in a way memory can feel. When a wind moves through the pines at Belzec, it carries tones that seem almost human, a resonance that bends the air. Survivors who have stood here say the silence hums. It is alive, like a low note of mourning that never ends. Some visitors claim they hear whispers, faint words they cannot understand. Scientists dismiss it as imagination, wind patterns, acoustics. But those who know the history say it differently. The ground remembers, and sometimes it speaks. It remembers the hands that built it too, the killers and the killed, both buried now in the same dust. The carpenters who built the chambers, the mechanics who adjusted the engines, the officers who signed reports, the guards who shoveled ashes. The ground holds them all. Their footprints overlap, indistinguishable in death. In the soil samples taken decades later, no one can tell which particles belong to victims and which to perpetrators. It is all the same dust, mixed by fire, fused by time. History loves clear divisions, good and evil, victim and killer. But the earth is not so neat. It holds everyone, and in that, it delivers its final judgment. All human actions end here, in silence, side by side. When rain falls on Belzec, it darkens the ground unevenly, tracing invisible boundaries. Archaeologists noticed at first how puddles form along the outlines of the old camp, how water gathers above the mass graves, refusing to soak in as if the soil rejects it. They say that even nature has limits, that there are places the earth does not want to swallow. At Belzec, the ground resists. It does not want to hide what happened. It wants to push it back to the surface. After heavy storms, small fragments still appear, bits of bone, charred wood, rusted metal. Each one is a message sent upward, a quiet rebellion against erasure. The earth also remembers the weight of lies. The signs that once hung above the chambers, the words bathhouse and disinfection, the false calm of the guards, the promises of safety. Those lies sank into the ground too, mixed with the blood and ash. And now, they rot differently than truth. Where lies were spoken, the soil is oddly barren, as if even plants will not grow where deception once flourished. The memorial's designers noticed it during construction. Some areas refuse to sustain life, no matter how fertile the seed. Perhaps it is only coincidence. Perhaps it is something more. As years turned to decades, the memory of Belzec began to shift from silence to story. People came to listen to what the earth had to say. Historians traced train routes, counted deportees, gathered documents. Survivors told their stories, their words anchoring what was once invisible. In that act, memory became restoration. Each word spoken about Belzec added another layer of truth over the lies that had buried it. The world, in listening, began to reclaim what the killers had tried to erase. Yet even now, the earth carries the deeper truth, one beyond language, one no book can hold. It remembers not just the facts, but the feeling, the trembling of air before death, the pressure of bodies against wood, the last heartbeat before silence. The people who come here today bring offerings, stones, flowers, candles. They kneel, touch the ground, whisper prayers. Some weep quietly, others can only stand in stillness. Each gesture is an act of conversation with the past. The earth accepts it all. It does not speak back, but it listens. And in its stillness, it gives something in return, the understanding that remembrance is not about sound, but about presence. To remember Belzec is to acknowledge that even when humans try to erase the past, the world itself will hold it until someone is ready to see again. The earth remembers the seasons of its suffering. It remembers the first frost of 1942, when the ground hardened and the digging of graves grew slower. It remembers the thaw of spring, when the pits overflowed with gas and decay, forcing the SS to build pyres to contain the stench. It remembers summer, when the smoke never cleared, when even the rain smelled of fire. It remembers autumn, when the dismantling began, when the fires were replaced by shovels and silence. It remembers winter again, when snow covered everything, when the camp was gone but the soil beneath was still warm. These seasons loop endlessly beneath the surface, repeating in the patterns of roots and frost. Time does not move forward here. It circles, and still, despite everything, the earth endures. The same ground that bore witness to unimaginable cruelty now carries footsteps of children, of visitors who come to learn, to mourn, to feel. The same soil that once burned now holds wildflowers that sway in the wind, their roots tangled with memory. Life has returned, but not in ignorance. It is not renewal that denies the past, but one that honors it. Life growing from death, beauty from horror. It is the earth's way of refusing to let destruction have the final word. There are those who say we should let such places rest, that digging, remembering, retelling only reopens wounds. But wounds that are buried too deep fester in the dark. The earth teaches otherwise. It does not hide what was done to it. It transforms it. The ashes that once smothered its breath have become part of its being. The soil does not forget, but it also does not hate. It holds everything, both horror and hope, as if to say that memory itself is what allows the world to continue. The earth remembers, too, those who come to listen, the teachers who bring students, the survivors who return in their final years, the strangers who stand in silence and feel something shift inside them. Each one becomes part of the story, their presence another layer added to the memory. The act of remembrance keeps the ground alive. Without it, the silence would fade into indifference. The earth does not need words to remember, but we do. We speak for it, and through that speaking, we ensure it never falls silent again. And perhaps that is the lesson Belzec gives the world, that memory is not fragile, not easily buried. It lives in places, in air, in the pulse of the ground beneath us. It endures because the earth itself refuses to forget. When the last witness dies, when the last document fades, when the last monument crumbles, the land will still remember. It will hold the weight of what was done and whisper it to the wind, waiting for someone to listen. The earth at Belzec is not sacred because of its past. It is sacred because it carries the truth. Every step upon it is a conversation between the living and the dead, between what was and what remains. It is not a graveyard. It is a mirror, showing us what humanity is capable of when conscience collapses, and what the world itself must bear when humans destroy. And as you walk away from it, through the quiet trees, back toward the noise of the living world, the silence follows. It clings to your clothes, to your breath, to your thoughts. It reminds you that memory is not a burden, but a duty, that the earth has done its part, holding the truth for as long as it had to. Now it is ours to carry. The earth remembers, but it cannot speak. That is why we must. Because if the earth can hold the memory of Belzec forever, then so must we. Chapter 13, Shadows That Never Left. The night around Belzec has a peculiar stillness. It is not the quiet of peace, nor the calm of untouched nature. It feels alive, a silence that listens. When darkness settles over the memorial stones, the wind moves differently. The trees sway as if to speak, but stop before they do. For those who have stood there after sunset, there is a sense that the past is not gone, only watching. Historians can record facts, architects can design memorials, but there are things beyond words that linger, things that history books can only hint at. Belzec is one of those places. Even now, 80 years later, its shadows have not left. They follow the living quietly, pressing their weight into time itself. After the war, when the noise of armies faded and the maps were redrawn, the ghosts of Belzec began their second existence, not in superstition, but in the minds of those who survived near it. The villagers who had once watched the trains come and go could not forget. Some dreamed of the smoke. Others heard phantom whistles in their sleep. One farmer swore that every spring, when the snow melted, his plow struck something hollow beneath the soil. He stopped farming that section of land. The ground doesn't want to be disturbed, he said. Decades later, when archaeologists examined the same patch, they found a depression that matched the outline of one of the mass graves. He had been right. The dead were still there, and somehow, they had made themselves known. In towns like Tomaso, Yaroslav, and Lwow, where the trains had departed, the memory of Belzec spread like fog. Survivors who returned from hiding found their homes empty, their neighbors silent. Some asked questions. Most received shrugs or downcast eyes. They went east, people said, though everyone knew what that meant. The name Belzec became a curse whispered only in private, a word heavy with guilt and grief. For the villagers, memory was dangerous. It tied them to something they could neither undo nor understand. But for those few Jewish survivors who escaped deportation, silence was unbearable. They wrote, testified, and mourned aloud because the world around them refused to. One survivor said, "It was like standing in a graveyard that did not know it was one." As years passed, the world turned its gaze elsewhere. The Cold War began, new borders hardened, and the Holocaust became a story buried beneath politics and ideology. In the Soviet-controlled East, Jewish suffering was folded into a broader narrative of fascist crimes against Soviet citizens. The individuality of the victims, their names, their prayers, their families, vanished again, this time beneath official silence. The shadows deepened. Even the few who tried to commemorate Belzec found resistance. Monuments were removed, speeches censored. The earth was left to carry the memory alone. Yet memory has a strange way of surviving where it is least expected. In the 1950s, a young Polish railway worker named Janusz lived near the old track that once led to the camp. Every morning, as he walked to his shift, he crossed a section of ground where the rails curved toward the forest. He said he could always smell something faintly metallic, even on cold days. He never spoke of it publicly, but in his journal he wrote, "It feels like the trains still pass through, unseen." His words were discovered years later by his daughter, who donated the notebook to a local museum. When historians read it, they realized what the smell had been, the trace of burning that still lived in the metal of the old rails, invisible but unforgotten. The shadows of Belzec were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They were the residue of memory, emotional, physical, historical. They appeared in the nightmares of those who had lived through the deportations, in the anxious silences of those who hadn't. A survivor of the Lwow ghetto, who had lost his wife and children to Belzec, once said that he felt his life had split into two parts, before the trains and after. "Even when I laugh," he said, "a part of me is still standing at that station." The human mind, like the earth, remembers in layers. Some are buried deep, some closer to the surface, but all remain. When Belzec was rebuilt as a memorial in the early 2000s, the workers themselves felt the weight of the place. They said that during excavation, the ground would breathe. Air would escape from the soil in short bursts, like exhalations. The archaeologists said it was methane, the gas left by decomposition. But one worker said quietly, it felt like the earth was sighing. They avoided heavy machinery out of respect, using hand tools instead. One evening, after a long day of surveying, they gathered near the edge of the site. The air was still, the sun sinking low. No one spoke, but all of them felt it, that sense that something vast and unseen was watching from beneath. They said later that even if they didn't believe in spirits, they believed in presence. In the years after the memorial opened, visitors from around the world came to see it. Some expected history, others expected closure. Most left with neither. One Israeli teacher who brought her students there described it best. "It is a place that takes sound away. Even the birds don't dare sing." She said that as she stood before the cracked basalt field, she felt the weight of every silence in her life. The silence of those who died, the silence of those who survived, and the silence of those who chose not to know. Belzec does not demand emotion. It imposes it. It confronts each visitor with the simple fact that absence can be more powerful than presence. There are a few photographs of Belzec in operation. The SS forbade cameras, and those who carried them knew better than to use them. The camp's memory exists instead through fragments, train schedules, coded telegrams, testimonies, a few blurred aerial shots. But photographs are not the only form of evidence. The Earth itself has become a living archive. Scientists who study soil composition call it environmental memory. They say that carbon residues, ash particles, and microelements form distinct patterns that can reveal what happened in a place long after human witnesses are gone. When they tested the soil at Belzec, they found traces of combustion at unnatural depths. It was as if the ground itself had recorded the flames. For those who study the Holocaust, Belzec represents the perfect crime, not because it was clever, but because it was designed to disappear. Unlike Auschwitz, there were no factories, no slave labor, no extended imprisonment. People arrived and died within hours. There was no time for life, no chance for resistance. In that brevity lies its horror, death reduced to efficiency, extermination without excess. Yet, even in that horror, the human spirit found ways to leave traces. In 1943, a prisoner working in the Sonderkommando buried a note in a glass bottle near the edge of the camp. It was found decades later. The letter read, "If anyone finds this, know that we were here. Remember us." Those 5 words, "Know that we were here," are perhaps the most haunting legacy of Belzec. The shadows that never left are the fulfillment of that plea. In the post-war years, memory took many forms. For survivors, it was grief disguised as endurance. For perpetrators, it was denial cloaked in obedience. For the children of both, it became confusion, an inheritance too heavy to understand. Some of the German guards who had served in Operation Reinhard returned home and lived quiet lives. Their neighbors never asked questions. Their children never knew. Only when the trials of the 1960s began did the truth crawl out of the dark corners of post-war Europe. One son of a former SS officer later said, "I realized my father had helped build a world that still haunted us." The shadows of Belzec were not confined to Poland. They reached into living rooms, into bedtime stories left untold, into the uneasy silences between generations. For Poland itself, Belzec became a mirror. It forced the country to confront not only German guilt, but also its own complicated history. The silence of bystanders, the fear of speaking, the small acts of kindness and betrayal that defined daily life under occupation. No nation emerged from the war unscarred, but in Belzec's case, the wound was deeper because it was invisible. For decades, people drove past it without knowing what lay beneath the trees. When the memorial was finally built, local residents began to visit too. Some wept openly, others stood apart, unable to look directly at what had happened so close to home. "We lived beside hell," one old man said, "and we called it a field." The shadows that never left are not supernatural. They are moral. They are the weight of what remains unresolved. The deaths without names, the crimes without graves, the humanity that was denied but not destroyed. Every generation that learns of Belzec adds another layer to its memory, and yet, the more we learn, the darker it becomes. Because the truth of Belzec is not just what was done, but how easily it was forgotten. The camp functioned for less than a year, killed nearly 500,000 people, and vanished almost without trace. That is not just a story of murder. It is a story of human indifference, of a world that looked away too quickly. And yet, the shadows that linger also carry something else: endurance. Every person who visits, every book written, every documentary made, every quiet moment of remembrance is proof that erasure failed. The Nazis believed they could build a system so efficient that even memory would be annihilated. They were wrong. The silence they left behind became the loudest testament of all. The shadows of Belzec do not hide the truth. They preserve it. They stretch across time, connecting the living to the dead, demanding to be seen not with the eyes but with the conscience. At dusk, when the sun lowers behind the forest, the memorial seems to breathe. The black stones catch the last light, turning gold for a moment before sinking into darkness. The air cools. Somewhere, an animal moves in the grass, cautious, slow. The world is still. In that moment, it feels as if time folds, as if the past leans forward, touching the present gently, reminding it that it still exists. The shadows lengthen, stretching toward the visitors, wrapping around their feet like a silent question. Will you remember? Will you carry this story when we cannot? Belzec no longer kills, but it still teaches. It shows that memory itself is a kind of resurrection, that truth, once spoken, can outlive even the most perfect silence. The shadows that never left are not curses. They are witnesses. They follow those who dare to look, not to haunt them, but to ensure that the world does not repeat what it has already buried once before. And when the last light fades and the night covers the ground, the wind moves again through the trees, whispering the same unending truth. They were here. They were real. The world tried to forget them, but the shadows never did. Chapter 14. The Long Road to Recognition. For nearly half a century after the war, Belzec existed in a kind of half-life, neither remembered nor completely forgotten. The world spoke of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek, but Belzec lingered at the edge of memory, a shadow without a name. It was not that people denied it had happened. It was that almost no one remained to tell the story. Of all who had entered its gates, only 2 had survived. The dead had no voices, and the killers had erased the evidence. For decades, history itself seemed to avert its eyes. Yet time, as it always does, began to shift. The silence cracked. Fragments of truth began to surface, in archives, in testimonies, in the restless whispers of the land. The long road to recognition had begun, though it would take generations to walk it. In the years after 1945, the immediate aftermath of war left little room for reflection. Europe was shattered. Cities lay in ruins, entire populations displaced, economies broken. The world's attention turned toward rebuilding, not remembering. In Poland, now under Soviet rule, the official narrative of suffering merged Jewish and Polish tragedy into one collective story of fascist oppression. The names of camps were mentioned, but their identities blurred. Auschwitz became the symbol of all evil. Others, like Belzec, receded into footnotes. The new regime built monuments to victims of fascism, but few mentioned the Jews by name. The graves of hundreds of thousands at Belzec remained unmarked, their voices buried twice, once by their killers and again by politics. The people who lived nearby carried their own uneasy relationship with the place. Some avoided it entirely, fearing the ghosts that rumors said still wandered there at night. Others worked the surrounding fields, pretending not to notice when the soil yielded bones or ash. In those early years, a strange mixture of guilt, ignorance, and superstition wrapped the area like fog. The few who tried to speak about what they had seen found little audience. One elderly villager recalled, decades later, "We heard the trains every day. Then one day they stopped. The smoke stopped, and no one came back. But no one asked why. It was not cruelty that silenced them. It was fear. Fear of the new authorities, fear of memory, fear of the unbearable truth that they had lived beside hell and done nothing." The first attempts to investigate Belzec came in the late 1940s, when the Polish Central Commission for the Investigation of German Crimes sent surveyors to the site. They dug shallow trenches, noted the smell of burning, and reported finding human remains close to the surface. But their work was brief and inconclusive. There were no resources for deeper excavation, no international attention to amplify their findings. Their reports were filed away, gathering dust in archives. The world, meanwhile, was moving on. The Nuremberg trials mentioned Operation Reinhard, but not Belzec specifically. Its name did not echo in the courtrooms of history. It was as if the camp had succeeded in its final mission, to vanish. In the 1950s and 60s, as survivors of the Holocaust began to share their stories, the focus remained elsewhere. Auschwitz was a city of death that still stood, its barracks intact, its chimneys visible. It was tangible proof of atrocity, and the world needed images. Belzec, by contrast, had none. No photographs, no ruins, no survivors to interview on camera. The camp had been built for speed and secrecy, and in that it achieved its perfection: murder without witnesses. Even in Israel, where the memory of the Shoah became central to national identity, Belzec remained largely unknown. The Yad Vashem archives held fragments, a testimony from Rudolf Ritter, a transport list, a few coded German reports, but little else. When Ritter published his account in 1946, it sold almost no copies. The world was not yet ready to listen to the voice of a man who had crawled out of a pit of ashes. Recognition, when it came, arrived slowly, in the smallest of steps. It began with names. In the 1960s, Jewish organizations in Poland and abroad began collecting lists of deported families. Among them, researchers noticed a pattern: entire towns in Galicia, each emptied in a matter of days, their residents resettled to the east. The destinations were rarely recorded, but when cross-referenced with German railway documents, the truth became clear: almost every one of those transports ended at Belzec. Historians like Raoul Hilberg and Yitzhak Arad began piecing together the timeline, reconstructing a place that no longer existed. Their work gave Belzec back its shape, if not yet its face. In Germany, the trials of the 1960s cracked open the silence further. Joseph Oberhauser, the camp's deputy commander, was brought to court in Munich. His trial drew little attention compared to Eichmann's in Jerusalem, but its impact was profound. Witnesses like Ritter described in calm, horrifying detail how the camp had functioned. The judges listened, the journalists scribbled, the audience held its breath. Oberhauser never denied being there. He claimed obedience, duty, inevitability. The sentence, 4.5 years, felt like an insult to the dead. But in a way, the trial achieved something more important than punishment. It gave Belzec a voice in public again. The newspapers printed its name. People read it, said it aloud, began to understand that there had been more than Auschwitz, more than Treblinka. There had been Belzec too, smaller, quieter, but every bit as lethal. In the 1970s, the first small monument was erected at the site. It was a crude structure, a concrete obelisk with a simple inscription: "To the victims of fascism." It did not mention Jews. It did not mention Germans. It did not mention numbers. It stood alone in a field, often vandalized, often ignored. But for those who came, it was something, a sign that the world had not entirely forgotten. Survivors visiting from abroad left stones at its base, a gesture of mourning in a landscape that still refused to speak. The wind carried their prayers through the grass, and for a brief moment, the silence softened. By the 1980s, global awareness of the Holocaust had deepened. Films, memorials, and education brought names like Auschwitz and Treblinka into common knowledge. Scholars began to ask about the lesser-known camps. Slowly, Belzec emerged from obscurity. The British National Archives released the decrypted German message known as the Hopeful Telegram, a routine radio report from January 1943 that listed the exact number of Jews murdered in each Operation Reinhard camp. Next to Belzec, the figure was precise: 434,508. It was the first concrete evidence, written by the perpetrators themselves, of the scale of Belzec's operation. The number shocked even historians. 434,000 lives, and barely a trace of them left behind. The telegram, once dismissed as bureaucratic code, had become a confession. Recognition, however, required more than documents. It required acknowledgement, empathy, and presence. In the 1990s, after the fall of communism, Poland began to re-examine its wartime history with new honesty. Belzec, long neglected, became a focus for both scholars and descendants of the victims. Excavations led by Polish archaeologist Andrzej Kola used ground-penetrating radar to locate the boundaries of the camp and its mass graves. The findings were staggering: 33 mass pits covering an area of 6 acres, filled with layers of ash and bone fragments. Kola refused to disturb the remains, choosing instead to document and preserve them. His team described the ground as breathing, a landscape still alive with its buried history. These discoveries finally pushed the world to act. In 2004, after years of planning and international collaboration, a new memorial was opened on the site. Designed by architects Andrzej Soliga, Zdzislaw Pidek, and Marcin Roszczyk, it was unlike any other Holocaust monument. There were no statues, no traditional symbols of mourning. Instead, the architect created a landscape of cracked basalt, dark and fractured like the burned earth it covered. A narrow path cuts through it, leading to a single gate, a void in the wall through which visitors must pass, echoing the journey of those who once entered. Along the outer walls, the names of hundreds of destroyed Jewish communities are engraved, representing not individuals but entire worlds that vanished into Belzec smoke. The memorial does not explain. It does not narrate. It simply exists, silent, immense, and unyielding. Visitors walk through it in near silence, the stones absorbing every sound. The absence of explanation forces reflection. People leave with more questions than answers, but that is the point. Belzec, which was built to erase, has become a place that demands confrontation with erasure itself. It teaches not through words, but through the weight of silence. International recognition followed. Museums added Belzec to their exhibits. Historians included it in their curricula. Survivors' descendants began pilgrimages to the site, bringing photographs of lost relatives, lighting candles, whispering names into the wind. The world began to understand that Belzec was not a footnote. It was a centerpiece of the machinery of annihilation, the prototype for death on an industrial scale. Its recognition was not only about numbers, but about the meaning of forgetting. Yet even now, the struggle for memory continues. There are those who still know little about it, who drive past the site unaware. Belzec does not impose itself like Auschwitz, with its gates and barbed wire. It hides behind a forest, quiet, dignified, waiting. In a way, it reflects the tragedy it embodies, a place that once devoured human lives so completely that even remembrance must fight to exist. But each year, more visitors come. School groups, researchers, families. They walk the path through the cracked stone field, feel the weight of the silence, and leave changed. Some say it feels like standing inside history's heartbeat. Others say it feels like standing on the edge of a wound that never closed. Recognition, at last, came not through noise but through listening. The world learned to hear the silence for what it was, a form of testimony, the only one Belzec could give. Every stone in the memorial, every breath of wind through the pines, every footstep on the dark path now speaks for the 400,000 who cannot. The long road to recognition was not about rediscovering a forgotten camp. It was about learning to live with what remembering means. To look at Belzec is to confront not only what was done there, but what humanity allowed itself to forget for so long. And so, as the sun sets behind the forest and the memorial turns gold for an instant before fading into darkness, the world finally stands still and listens. The silence that once served the killers now belongs to the victims. The land that was meant to erase them now preserves them. Recognition has come, not as a shout, but as a whisper that refuses to fade. It took decades for the world to say their names again, but now that it does, the echoes will never die. For Belzec has become more than a place. It is a voice that speaks through absence, a reminder that even the quietest corners of history demand to be heard. Chapter 15. The Echo of the Unburied. There are places in the world where silence does not mean peace, where the wind moves not through trees, but through memory. Belzec is one of those places. You can feel it the moment you step onto its soil, the weight beneath your feet, the faint hum in the air, the kind of stillness that presses on your chest rather than soothes it. It is not haunted by ghosts in the way old myths imagine. It is haunted by truth, a truth so vast, so unbearable, that it seeps through the ground itself. The echo of the unburied lingers here, not as sound, but as presence. Every inch of soil, every blade of grass, carries the residue of what happened and what was lost. The dead are not gone. They are simply waiting to be remembered. When the world speaks of the Holocaust, it often turns to the visible, to the gates of Auschwitz, the watchtowers of Majdanek, the ruins of Treblinka. These places stand as monuments of evidence. But Belzec stands as the opposite, a monument of absence. There is nothing left to see, no walls, no barbed wire, no chimneys. Only the ground, vast and dark, heavy with what cannot be seen. The Germans built it to vanish, to be erased the moment its work was done. Yet the attempt to hide it only made it more eternal. For what cannot be spoken has a way of echoing louder than anything shouted aloud. The dead here speak through quiet, through the shifting soil, through the air that trembles, through the memory that refuses to fade. After the memorial opened in 2004, visitors came in growing numbers, drawn not by spectacle, but by an invisible gravity. Survivors' descendants walked the paths where their ancestors vanished. Historians came with notebooks, priests with prayers, students with wide, uncertain eyes. The experience was never one of learning facts, but of feeling something ancient and raw. Many said they could not explain it, that standing there was like being inside a heartbeat. Others said it felt like guilt. A Polish woman who lived nearby said she had avoided the sight her whole life, but one day, curiosity or conscience drew her in. When she left, she said quietly, "I didn't visit a cemetery. I visited a wound." The echo of the unburied reaches far beyond Belzec's boundaries. It hums in the bloodlines of those who lost, those who survived, those who inherited the memory without ever living it. Children of survivors grow up with nightmares they never earned, trains, smoke, running without escape. They carry the silence of parents who could not speak, who replaced stories with stares, who built their lives on fragile normalcy because the truth would have broken them. The Holocaust was not a single event, but a fracture that runs through generations. And Belzec is its deepest break, a scar so complete it almost disappeared. To inherit that silence is to feel something ancient pressing from beneath your own life, asking to be named. For Poland, too, the echo remains unresolved. The soil of Belzec is Polish. The victims were Polish Jews. The killers were German. But ownership of memory does not follow borders. For decades, the politics of remembrance turned the place into a mirror that no one wanted to look into. Some saw it as shame, others as burden. Yet with time, as the old fears gave way to new generations, Belzec began to be seen differently, not as accusation, but as inheritance. The young Poles who now visit the site come not to explain or defend, but to understand. They bring flowers, candles, stones. They kneel in silence, not because they are guilty, but because they are human. The echo of the unburied reaches them too, whispering that memory is not national, it is moral. Every culture has its way of burying the dead, of giving form to grief. But what happens when burial itself becomes impossible? At Belzec, the dead were denied everything. No rights, no names, no resting place. The killers exhumed their bodies, burned them, scattered the ashes, and plowed the soil to hide the evidence. It was the ultimate act of dehumanization, to erase not just life, but the very trace of existence. Yet, paradoxically, it was this denial that made Belzec sacred. The ashes mixed with the earth, turning the ground itself into a grave that cannot be undone. Every step on that soil is a step on a body. Every gust of wind lifts fragments of those who once breathed. The world may not have buried them, but the earth did. It holds them still, uncountable, indivisible, eternal. When scientists studied the site in the late 1990s, they described the ground as alive with memory. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the vast outlines of the mass graves, 33 in total, some more than 20 feet deep, layered with ash and crushed bone. The soil samples showed traces of calcium, phosphorus, and human fat, silent signatures of combustion. The archaeologists stopped digging when they realized that every inch of the site was sacred. They mapped instead, creating a blueprint of the invisible. One of them later said, "We did not discover the dead. We discovered that they had never left." That realization changed the way Belzec was treated forever. The memorial that followed was not built on top of the dead, but around them. The design was meant to let the ground breathe. In that breathing ground, memory lives differently than it does in books or monuments. It is physical, sensory, almost biological. Visitors have described hearing faint echoes underfoot, as if the earth itself were murmuring. Others have spoken of sudden chills, a heaviness in the chest, a sense of being watched. Skeptics call it suggestion, psychology, the mind reacting to tragedy. But even they admit, the atmosphere is unlike anywhere else. You cannot stand at Belzec and feel nothing. The silence has texture. It presses against you, gently but insistently, as though asking you to stay, to listen, to remember. The echo of the unburied does not demand grief. It demands presence. In Jewish tradition, memory is a moral commandment. Soccer, remember, is both obligation and prayer. At Belzec, remembrance takes on its most painful meaning. There are no names to recite, no graves to visit, only the knowledge that beneath the earth lie hundreds of thousands who never had a final word. And yet, by walking there, by standing on that soil, visitors fulfill the oldest act of mourning, to be with the dead. Each footstep is a kind of prayer, each breath a form of witness. The memorial's design amplifies that experience. The dark stone swallows sound, the walls rise like cliffs of silence, and at the path's end, an opening, the symbolic gate of death, invites the living to step into the void and emerge again, changed. Over the years, Belzec has begun to take its rightful place in collective memory. Documentaries, books, and testimonies have brought it back from the edge of forgetting. Historians have reconstructed its chronology, its machinery, its purpose. But what cannot be reconstructed is the human scale of loss. Each number, 434,508, the figure from the hopeful telegram, conceals a universe of stories. Among them were musicians, doctors, tailors, mothers, children, rabbis, beggars, dreamers. They lived entire lives that vanished without a trace. To think of them as numbers is to repeat the crime. To imagine them as people is to restore what the killers tried to destroy. Every whisper of the unburied is a call to remember not the statistics, but the souls. For decades, those souls were forgotten, their names unspoken, their faces unknown. But remembrance has a way of finding its path through time. Today, descendants of the victims search archives, travel to Poland, walk through Belzec, and place small stones along the black basalt walls. Some bring photos of relatives lost in the war, sepia portraits rescued from family albums. They hold the pictures up to the sky, as if reintroducing the faces to the air of the world. In that simple act, the unburied find recognition. The dead are seen again, and the echo softens, not silenced, but heard. The echo of the unburied also exists in the art, the music, the literature inspired by this place. Composers have written symphonies of silence. Poets have compared Belzec to a black hole of history, and painters have tried to capture its absence in shades of gray and ash. Each attempt fails in some way, because Belzec cannot be translated. It resists interpretation. It refuses simplification. But in those failures lies meaning. To fail at depicting Belzec is to succeed in acknowledging its enormity. The unburied are not looking for beauty. They are asking for truth. As the decades pass, the survivors fade, their voices replaced by recordings, their testimonies archived. Soon, there will be no one left who saw the smoke rise, who smelled the air, who heard the trains. The burden of remembrance will shift entirely to those who came after, to historians, to teachers, to ordinary people willing to listen. And that is when the echo will matter most. For when memory no longer lives in people, it must live in places. Belzec will remain, not as a museum, but as a living conscience. The earth itself will continue to remember what humanity might forget. The unburied will continue to whisper through the soil until someone bends down to hear them again. In the twilight of evening, when the last visitors leave and the memorial falls silent, the light changes. The cracked stone field glows faintly under the setting sun, as if lit from within. The air cools, the forest darkens, and for a moment, the boundary between life and memory blurs. It feels as if the dead breathe with the wind, as if their presence fills the space that the world once tried to empty. The echo deepens, not in sound, but in feeling. It is not sadness. It is endurance. A quiet reminder that remembrance is not a single act, but an eternal dialogue between the living and the lost. Belzec's story ends where it began, in silence. But it is no longer the silence of suppression or denial. It is the silence of reverence, of acknowledgement, of truth. The unburied have found a voice not in words, but in the weight of their absence. Their echo stretches beyond the borders of Poland, beyond the confines of history, into the collective soul of humanity. It asks a simple question: will you remember us, or will we have to keep whispering? As the night deepens and the stars appear above the dark field, the world around Belzec becomes impossibly still. The air carries no sound of traffic, no voices, only the low hum of existence. Somewhere in that silence, if you listen long enough, you might hear it, faint, rhythmic, like a breath. The earth itself inhaling and exhaling the memory of those it holds. The echo of the unburied, soft, eternal, patient, reminding us that the past does not rest. It waits, it listens, and it asks us, always, to do the same.